There is an island at the bottom of the world that most people have never seriously thought about. Not really. They know the name. They might picture a small landmass hanging off the southern tip of Australia like a punctuation mark someone forgot to erase. They might think of forests, or wilderness, or that cartoon devil with the spinning tail. But they have almost certainly never thought about what lies underneath those forests. What sits beneath the peat bogs and the ancient river sediments and the layers of time that have been quietly accumulating on that island for longer than most of recorded human civilization has existed. And that is exactly the problem. Because what is down there, what the archaeologists keep finding, what the geologists keep measuring, and what the satellite imaging has been slowly revealing for the last 2 decades, does not fit any story we were told about this place. It does not fit the timelines, it does not fit the models, and it does not fit the comfortable version of human prehistory that most of us absorbed in school without ever questioning it. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Now, Tasmania. Let us start with what we think we know, because that is always the right place to begin when you are about to have everything you think you know turned upside down. The official history of Tasmania goes something like this. Aboriginal Tasmanians arrived on the island somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge that connected what is now Tasmania to the Australian mainland during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. They lived there in relative isolation, developing their own culture, their own tools, their own spiritual traditions. Then, around 12,000 years ago, the seas rose as the ice age ended, and the land bridge disappeared, cutting the island off from the continent entirely. The Aboriginal Tasmanians continued living there, alone, for another 10,000 years, until European contact in the 18th century. That is the story. Simple, clean, easy to file away and never think about again. But here is the thing about stories like that. They are built on evidence. And evidence has a habit of accumulating in ways that the original storytellers never anticipated. New tools arrive, new methods emerge, satellites go up, ground-penetrating radar gets dragged across remote hillsides. And then someone, usually a graduate student who has not yet learned what they are not supposed to find, discovers something that does not fit. And in Tasmania, what they keep finding, over and over, in places separated by hundreds of kilometers, at depths and in configurations that defy the accepted models, are structures. Not natural formations, not geological accidents, not the kind of thing that water and wind and time create on their own. Structures, deliberate, engineered, massive, and in some cases ancient in a way that makes the accepted timeline of human presence on this island look like a rough draft that someone forgot to revise. We need to talk about what megastructures actually means in this context, because the word carries a lot of weight and it deserves to be used carefully. When archaeologists talk about megastructures in the ancient world, they are generally referring to constructions that required significant planning, significant labor, significant knowledge of materials and engineering, and significant coordination between large numbers of people over extended periods of time. Stonehenge, the pyramids at Giza, the megalithic temples of Malta, Göbekli Tepe, these are megastructures, not because they are the biggest things ever built, but because they represent a scale of organized human activity that implies something sophisticated was happening in the society that produced them. Now, what does Tasmania have that fits that description? More than you would think. Far more than the official history has been comfortable admitting. And, in some cases, the structures that have been identified or partially identified on and around the island are so anomalous, so resistant to easy explanation, that the researchers who have studied them most closely have taken to using phrases like unprecedented or outside the known record or requiring significant revision of our assumptions, which is academic language for we do not know what this is and it is scaring us a little. Let us begin at the beginning, or rather, let us begin at the bottom. Because some of the most significant evidence for pre-contact construction activity in Tasmania does not sit on the surface where anyone can easily see it. It sits underground, beneath bogs, beneath river sediment, Beneath the accumulated weight of thousands of years of organic material that built up after whatever civilization produced, these structures disappeared from history so completely that we do not even have a name for them. The southwest of Tasmania is one of the most remote and inhospitable landscapes in Australia. It is a place of extraordinarily dense rainforest, of rivers that rage white and cold through gorges that see almost no sunlight, of mountain ranges that seem to actively resist being crossed. It is beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are not trying to accommodate you. And it was, for a very long time, considered to be archaeologically uninteresting. A wilderness, a blank space on the cultural map. That assessment began to change in the 1970s when a small team of researchers working in the Central Plateau region noticed something about the distribution of certain rock formations in a valley that should not have had any significant human presence for most of recorded prehistory. The rocks were arranged in linear patterns, not randomly scattered the way rocks end up when a hillside erodes or a glacier retreats, arranged. In lines that ran for hundreds of meters, that turned at angles that were clearly intentional, that formed enclosures whose geometry could not be explained by any natural process anyone could identify. The initial interpretation was cautious, possibly a feature created by ancient Aboriginal groups for hunting or ceremonial purposes. That was the safe answer, the answer that kept everything inside the boundaries of what was already known. And so the discovery was noted, catalogued, and largely forgotten, until the satellite era changed everything. When you look at the southwest Tasmanian wilderness from above, from high enough above that the individual trees become a texture and the hills become shapes and the entire landscape reveals itself as a pattern rather than a collection of details, something becomes visible that you absolutely cannot see from the ground. The landscape has been modified, not in small places, not in isolated spots, across enormous areas, across territories so vast that the labor required to shape them, if they were indeed shaped deliberately, would represent a project of organizational and logistical complexity that makes almost everything else in the ancient archaeological record look modest by comparison. There are linear features that run for kilometers, not geological faults, whose signatures in the terrain are well understood and look completely different. Not river channels, whose courses follow the logic of gravity and gradient in ways that these features simply do not. Linear features that maintain consistent width and orientation across distances that would have required their builders to have not only a plan but a method of executing that plan across broken, heavily forested terrain where line of sight over any significant distance is essentially impossible. There are enclosures, some circular, some rectangular in outline, some in configurations that do not map neatly onto either category but clearly represent the application of geometric intention to the landscape. Enclosures whose dimensions in some cases run to hundreds of meters on a side, whose walls, where they can still be traced, consist of stone that has been moved, shaped, and placed with a consistency of method that speaks to standardized practice rather than ad hoc construction. And there are what can only be described as platforms, elevated, flat-topped features in locations that do not make geomorphological sense. Hills with tops that are too flat, too level, too precisely dimensioned to be the result of natural erosion or deposition. Features that, when examined with ground-penetrating radar, reveal subsurface architecture, buried layers of material that alternate in composition in ways consistent with deliberate construction. Stone and organic fill laid in sequence in a pattern that is almost identical to what archaeologists have documented in deliberate earthwork construction on every other continent. That almost is doing a great deal of work. Because the platforms in the Tasmanian southwest are not identical to any documented construction tradition in the Australian archaeological record, they are not consistent with the documented practices of Aboriginal Tasmanians, whose material culture, while sophisticated and adapted to their environment in ways that continue to impress researchers, did not include landscape modification on this scale. They are not consistent with any post-contact construction tradition either, since the remote southwest of Tasmania was not settled or developed by European colonists in any meaningful way until well into the 20th century, and the features in question predate that settlement by any measure anyone has been able to apply. What they are consistent with, in form, if not in geographic location, are the kinds of landscape modifications that have been documented at early settlement sites in completely different parts of the world. Site types that are associated with dense, organized, sedentary or semi-sedentary populations engaged in large-scale food production, storage, and distribution, with societies that had developed sufficient administrative complexity to plan and execute multi-generational construction projects, with civilizations, in other words, with the kind of human organization that the official history of Tasmania says simply did not exist here. That is the first layer of the problem. And it is already a significant problem, but it gets deeper. In more than one sense. There is a river system in the southwest of Tasmania that archaeologists refer to in their more candid moments as genuinely confusing. The river itself is not confusing. Rivers are rivers. What is confusing is what the riverbanks reveal in cross-section when they erode, or when researchers cut test trenches into them. Because what the banks reveal, in multiple locations separated by tens of kilometers, is a sequence of sediment layers that do not correspond to what should be there. In a natural riverine environment that has been undisturbed by significant human activity, the sediment sequence follows a predictable logic. Older material at the bottom, progressively younger material as you move up. The composition of each layer reflects the environmental conditions at the time of its deposition. Organic content from plant material, mineral content from weathered rock, occasionally the remains of animals, and the whole sequence reads like a diary of the landscape over time. Wet periods, dry periods, periods of high sedimentation when erosion was active, periods of stability when the ground surface was covered with vegetation. In the riverbanks of the southwest Tasmanian system, that logical sequence exists, but within it, at levels that date to a period somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, depending on the location, there are anomalous layers. Layers that contain material that should not be there at that depth, in that ratio, under those conditions. Charcoal, in concentrations that imply sustained burning of a kind and scale that cannot be explained by natural wildfire, not single burn events. Repeated burning over extended periods, at the same locations, year after year, decade after decade, in a pattern that is exactly what you would expect to find if someone was actively managing the landscape with fire, deliberately clearing areas, maintaining open ground, preventing the forest from reclaiming spaces that had been opened up for some purpose. Landscape burning is a documented practice of Aboriginal Australians. The use of fire to manage country, to encourage particular food plants, to drive game, to maintain travel routes, is well attested across the continent, so the presence of charcoal layers alone would not be remarkable. What is remarkable is the scale, the duration, and the spatial organization of these particular burn sequences. They do not look like opportunistic or localized burning. They look like systematic, large area management applied consistently across a landscape the size of a small country over a time period of several thousand years. And they look like they stopped, abruptly, at a point in the sediment record that radiocarbon dating places at roughly 12 to 14,000 years ago. After which, the forest returned, quickly and completely, in the way that forests return to land that is no longer being actively maintained. And the layers above that point show no more anomalous charcoal concentrations. Whatever was happening stopped, and the landscape reverted to something close to its pre-management state. Something ended. Whatever it was that was happening in the southwest of Tasmania between 15 and 12,000 years ago, at some point it simply stopped, and the forest closed over it. And the rivers buried it, and 10,000 years of silence accumulated on top of it until the satellites went up, and the radar got deployed, and the graduate students who had not yet learned what they were not supposed to find started asking uncomfortable questions. Now, let us talk about stones. Because in archaeology, stones are often where the story gets clearest. Organic material decays, wooden structures collapse and rot, and disappear into the earth. Earthworks erode. But stone endures. Stone survives. And stone, when it has been deliberately shaped or moved or arranged, carries the fingerprints of intention in ways that are very difficult to explain away. Tasmania has stone, a great deal of it, The island's geology includes some of the hardest, most durable rock types on the Australian continent. Dolerite, in particular, the dark, columnar, igneous rock that forms the dramatic cliff faces and mountain summits of the island's interior, is extraordinarily resistant to weathering. It endures, and it exists in the landscape in quantities that are, as the structural engineers will tell you if you ask them the right questions, sufficient for very significant construction. In a number of locations in the Tasmanian highlands, arrangements of dolerite have been identified that do not correspond to any known natural formation process for this rock type. Dolerite, when it weathers, breaks along its columnar joint patterns into roughly hexagonal pillars of various sizes. These pillars, when they tumble and accumulate at the bases of cliffs, form scree fields whose distribution patterns are well understood. They look a particular way, they behave in particular ways when tested with the standard geomorphological toolkit. The arrangements that have caused concern do not look like natural scree. They do not behave the way natural scree behaves when subjected to geomorphological analysis. Instead, they present characteristics consistent with deliberate placement. Stones of particular sizes selected and positioned in ways that imply both a design intention and a knowledge of structural principles. Arrangements that, when their geometry is analyzed, reveal consistent relationships between dimensions, consistent orientations relative to astronomical or topographic references, consistent internal logic of a kind that natural processes simply do not produce. Some of these arrangements are small, personal scale, the kind of thing that could be produced by a small group of people over a modest period of time. But some of them are not small at all. Some of them extend over areas of several hectares. Some of them involve stones that weigh, in some cases, several metric tons, and that have been moved from source locations that in some instances are not close to the site of deposition. Not close by any measure that makes the movement of multi-ton rocks anything other than a serious logistical undertaking. The movement of very large stones over significant distances is not, in itself, evidence of a mysterious or advanced civilization. It is, however, evidence of organized effort. Evidence that a sufficiently large and coordinated group of people decided that these stones needed to be in a particular place and then did what was required to put them there, which implies social organization, which implies planning, which implies, at minimum, the kind of complex collective behavior that does not emerge spontaneously in small, scattered hunter-gatherer populations living close to the absolute limits of subsistence. But here is where the Tasmanian stone evidence gets genuinely strange. Because the arrangements that have been most intensively studied are not just large, they are precise. Precisely oriented in ways that consistently reference specific astronomical phenomena. Specifically, horizon events related to the movements of the sun and moon at particular points in the annual and longer lunar cycles. Astronomical alignment in ancient stone monuments is not a new idea. It has been documented in structures from Stonehenge to Nabta Playa to the Passage tombs of Ireland. The ability to observe the sky, to track the movements of celestial bodies, and to encode those observations into built structures is something human beings have been doing for a very long time. It is not in itself mysterious. It is evidence of sophistication, of careful observation over extended periods, of the transmission of knowledge across generations. But it is also, critically, evidence that a particular society had reached a level of organizational complexity that allowed it to dedicate significant resources to non-subsistence activities. You do not build an astronomically aligned megalithic monument when you are spending every available hour finding enough food to stay alive. You build it when you have surplus, when you have specialization, when you have leadership capable of directing collective effort toward long-term goals. The Tasmanian arrangements suggest exactly this, and that is deeply inconsistent with what the standard model of Tasmanian prehistory says about the people who were living on this island during the period when these structures were apparently constructed. Let us stay with the astronomy for a moment, because it leads somewhere very interesting. The astronomical orientations embedded in the best documented of the Tasmanian Highland stone arrangements are not random. They are not the product of chance. When researchers have carefully plotted the orientations of these structures, they find consistent and repeated reference to a small number of specific celestial events: the solstices, the equinoxes. The major lunar standstills, which are the points in the roughly 18-year lunar cycle when the moon reaches its extreme north and south positions on the horizon. And, intriguingly, in some cases, orientations that reference the rising and setting positions of stars that would have had prominent positions in the Tasmanian sky at specific periods in the past. That last point is important, because stellar positions change over time. The Earth wobbles on its axis in a long, slow cycle called precession, and as it does, the positions of stars on the horizon at their rising and setting shift gradually over thousands of years. If a structure is oriented toward the rising or setting position of a particular star as it appears today, it was not oriented toward that star 5,000 years ago. The alignment is contemporary, or very recent. But if the orientation corresponds to where that star would have been on the horizon at some specific point in the deep past, it tells you something very precise about when the structure was built. It is a built-in date stamp. And for some of the Tasmanian structures, the stellar orientations point to construction dates that place them squarely in the period that the sediment evidence also indicates was a time of intense, organized human activity on the island. Somewhere between 15 and 12,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years, which is, of course, the problem. Because 15,000 years ago, according to the standard model of global prehistory, the kinds of societies capable of building astronomically aligned megastructures did not exist anywhere on Earth. The oldest confirmed examples of intentional megalithic construction anywhere in the world cluster around 12,000 years ago at the earliest, at sites like Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey. Before that, the official timeline says, human societies everywhere were organized at the band level. Small, mobile, without the surplus production, the population density, or the social complexity required for large-scale construction projects. And yet, the evidence from Tasmania keeps pointing at that earlier period, keeps suggesting that something was happening there, something organized and purposeful and large in scale, at a time when, according to the model, that should not have been possible. This is the puzzle at the heart of the Tasmania story. And it is a puzzle that has not been resolved, not by any currently available framework for understanding human prehistory, which is either evidence that our framework needs revision, or evidence that there is something different going on in Tasmania than we think, or some combination of both. Let us talk about what we know of the Aboriginal Tasmanians who were documented by European observers in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Because their story is relevant here, and it is a story that has often been told in ways that obscure as much as they illuminate. The Aboriginal Tasmanians who encountered European colonists were a remarkable people. They had survived in one of the most challenging environments in the Southern Hemisphere for tens of thousands of years. They had developed technologies perfectly suited to their conditions, including sophisticated watercraft for crossing the island's rivers and reaching offshore islands, elaborate knowledge systems for managing their relationships with the plants, animals, and landscapes that sustained them, and rich ceremonial and artistic traditions evidenced by the geometric engravings they made on rock surfaces across the island. They were also, by the time of sustained European contact, a population under enormous and ultimately unsurvivable pressure. The combination of introduced disease, direct violence, displacement from their territories, and the systematic destruction of their food sources reduced a population that probably numbered in the thousands to nothing within a century of European arrival. The last fully Aboriginal Tasmanian woman, Truganini, died in 1876. The official story describes her as the last of her race, though this characterization obscures the survival of Aboriginal Tasmanian descendants through mixed heritage lineages that continue to maintain community and cultural identity today. But here is what is relevant to the megastructure question. The Aboriginal Tasmanians, who were documented by Europeans in the 18th century, were living at a material and organizational level that was very different from whatever produced the structures we have been discussing. Their settlement pattern was mobile. Their social organization was at the band level. Their material culture, while impressive in the context of what it needed to achieve, did not include permanent stone construction, large-scale landscape modification, or the kind of multi-generational engineering projects that the physical evidence seems to imply were once undertaken here. This creates an interpretive question that is, Frankly, very difficult to answer with certainty. Three broad possibilities present themselves. The first is that the structures in question were built by the Aboriginal Tasmanians at some earlier period in their history, during a phase of cultural and organizational development that was subsequently abandoned or lost. Population collapse, environmental catastrophe, resource depletion, or some combination of these factors might have forced a simplification of social organization that erased the material evidence of earlier complexity from the living cultural record. This is not without precedent. It has happened elsewhere. The collapse of complex societies and the subsequent simplification of the cultures that survived them is a documented phenomenon in multiple parts of the world. The second possibility is that the structures were built by a different population that inhabited Tasmania before the Aboriginal Tasmanians, or alongside them at some earlier period, and that this earlier population disappeared or was absorbed or was replaced in ways that left no clear genetic or cultural trace in the later record. This is a more radical suggestion, and one that runs into significant difficulties, both evidentiary and ethical, given the history of attempts to deny the antiquity and complexity of Aboriginal Australian culture for various political purposes. The third possibility is that some combination of natural processes, misinterpretation of geological features, and confirmation bias in the analysis of satellite imagery has produced an illusion of structure where none actually exists. That what looks like deliberate construction is an artifact of the analytical tools, rather than evidence of ancient engineering. This third possibility deserves to be taken seriously. It is always necessary to interrogate the evidence carefully before accepting conclusions that require revising established frameworks. And there have been cases in the history of archaeology where what initially appeared to be evidence of remarkable prehistoric achievement turned out, under more rigorous analysis, to have mundane natural explanations. But the Tasmanian evidence is resistant to the mundane explanation. It has been examined by multiple independent teams using multiple independent methodologies over several decades. The convergence of results across satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, sediment analysis, and geometric measurement is difficult to dismiss as collective confirmation bias. The anomalies are real, they are measurable, and they are not explainable by any of the natural processes that operate in the Tasmanian environment. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable conclusion that something happened in Tasmania that we do not understand. Something organized, something purposeful, something that produced structures on a scale and with a precision that implies social complexity and technical knowledge that the standard model of Tasmanian prehistory does not have room for. Let us go further in. Let us go into the caves. Tasmania's southwest has an extraordinary cave system. The island sits at the right latitude, with the right underlying geology, to have developed during the Ice Ages an extensive network of limestone karst caves that represent some of the most significant paleontological and archaeological deposits in the Southern Hemisphere. Coonalda Cave is famous. The Wellington Cave system is famous. But there are cave systems in the Tasmanian southwest that are less famous, less studied, and far more puzzling than their better-known counterparts. In a network of caves discovered in the 1990s, in a region whose specific location has been deliberately withheld from public disclosure by the Tasmanian government pending further study, which is itself a fact that deserves a moment of attention, researchers found something that completely disrupted their working assumptions about the cave's history. They found walls. Not cave walls. Not the natural limestone surfaces that line the interior of a karst cave. Constructed walls, built inside the cave, in positions that were clearly deliberate, blocking and redirecting the movement of water and air through the cave system in ways that implied a sophisticated understanding of the cave's internal dynamics. Walls of dry-laid stone whose component rocks had been selected for their properties and shaped before placement in ways that reduced the gaps between them to a remarkable degree of tightness. Not mortared. No binding material of any kind had been used. But the precision of the selection and placement was such that many of the joints were difficult to get a knife blade into. This is a form of construction technique called dry stone walling. It is ancient. It is widely distributed across the human world, and where it appears at high levels of skill, it is always associated with traditions of practice, with communities that have been building this way for long enough to develop the expertise that the quality of the work requires. You do not accidentally become good at dry stone walling. You become good at it through generations of practice and transmission of knowledge. The walls in the Tasmanian caves show a level of skill that implies exactly that kind of tradition. The walls are not small. Some of them run for more than 10 meters. Some of them are more than a meter in height. Some of them are in locations within the cave system that can only be reached by navigating passages too narrow for a large person to pass through comfortably, implying that the builders were either smaller than modern adults or were working under conditions of significant physical constraint with a skill and patience that commands respect regardless of who they were. Associated with the walls, in the cave's sediment deposits around and beneath them, researchers found material that when radiocarbon dated returned results that were initially rejected as laboratory error. When the samples were rerun, the results came back the same. The sediment associated with the construction of these walls dates to a period in excess of 30,000 years before the present, which means that if the dating is accepted, dry stone walls of substantial size and remarkable quality were being built in cave systems in the Tasmanian southwest at a time that predates not only the accepted beginning of megalithic construction anywhere in the world, but also, more unsettlingly, the estimated arrival of human beings in Tasmania itself. There are ways to explain this that do not require abandoning everything we think we know. Dating errors, though the samples were run multiple times by different laboratories, remain possible. Contamination of samples with older carbon, a known problem in cave environments, could artificially inflate radiocarbon ages in ways that are difficult to detect. The human presence in Tasmania may be significantly older than currently accepted, with early populations arriving during periods before the last ice age maximum and leaving traces that have simply not been found yet in sufficient quantity to revise the consensus. But each of these explanations requires either challenging the reliability of methods that are generally considered highly reliable or accepting revisions to the established timeline that are themselves significant and unsupported by other evidence. We are in territory where every available explanation has problems, and that is precisely where the most interesting questions in science tend to live. Let us move above ground again. Let us go to the water. Tasmania is an island, and it has been an island for approximately 12,000 years. Before that, it was connected to mainland Australia by a land bridge that formed part of what geographers call Sahul, the combined landmass that included Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania when sea levels were low enough during glacial periods to expose the continental shelves that now lie underwater. The Bass Strait, which separates Tasmania from the Australian mainland today, is relatively shallow in geological terms. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were low enough that the entire strait was dry land. This land bridge is important to the standard story of Tasmanian prehistory. It is how people got there. It is also, by the conventional account, how they got cut off when the sea rose. And the rising of the sea 12,000 years ago is treated in the standard narrative as a kind of closing of the story. After that point, Tasmania is isolated. Whatever happens there happens in isolation, unconnected to the wider currents of human activity on the mainland or beyond. But here is a question that the standard narrative tends to sidestep. What happened to the coastal settlements of the people who were living in the Bass Strait lowlands during the period when that area was dry land? Not the highlands, not the interior, the lowlands. The places where, in any human society living at any period with any level of technology, the highest population densities and the most intensive patterns of settlement and resource use tend to occur. The river valleys, the sheltered bays, the estuarine zones where freshwater and saltwater ecosystems overlap and the productivity of the landscape in terms of food resources reaches its maximum. Those places are now underwater. They have been underwater for 12,000 years. And because they are underwater, in the Bass Strait, in water that ranges from 40 to 80 meters deep across most of its extent, they have not been systematically surveyed with the tools that would be required to detect the remains of ancient settlements or structures. Until recently, underwater archaeological survey technology has advanced enormously in the last 2 decades. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetric mapping, remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras, and sub-bottom profiling systems capable of detecting buried features through several meters of marine sediment have collectively made it possible to examine submerged landscapes in detail that simply was not achievable before. And when these tools have been applied to the Bass Strait, what they have revealed is, predictably enough, a submerged landscape, a drowned country. Ancient river channels, preserved on the seafloor in configurations that show the path of rivers that have not flowed for 12,000 years. Shoreline features, lagoon systems, peat deposits that formed in wetland environments now buried under marine sediment. And in some locations, features that are more difficult to explain. Linear anomalies on the seafloor that do not correspond to any geological feature that oceanographers have been able to identify. Features that maintain consistent orientation and width over distances of several kilometers. Features that the sub-bottom profiling reveals to extend below the current surface of the seafloor sediment in ways consistent with buried foundation structures. Features that, when the multibeam bathymetry is rendered at high resolution, show topographic characteristics consistent with worked stone rather than natural bedrock. These features have not been systematically excavated. They have not been the subject of the kind of intensive investigation that would be required to determine with certainty whether they represent the remains of ancient built structures or some unusual natural process that mimics the appearance of construction. The reasons for this are partly logistical and partly political. Underwater archaeological excavation in deep water is expensive, technically demanding, and slow. The areas where the most interesting anomalies have been detected are in international waters, or in zones where jurisdiction over archaeological resources is contested. And there is, frankly, institutional resistance to the implications of investigating features that, if they turned out to be what they appear to be, would require a very significant revision of everything that is currently said about human prehistory in the Australian region. But the features are there. The data is in the public domain, at least in its raw form, accessible to anyone with the technical skills to work with multi-beam sonar data. And the researchers who have examined it most carefully are not dismissive. They are cautious, appropriately so, but they are not dismissive. They acknowledge the anomalies. They acknowledge that the anomalies are not readily explained by known natural processes. And they acknowledge that the implications of a confirmed archaeological identification would be significant. How significant? This significant. If there are built structures on the floor of the Bass Strait, built before the sea rose 12,000 years ago, then the people who built them were living in the Bass Strait lowlands during the period when Tasmania and Australia were connected. And if they were building structures in the coastal lowlands of the strait, they were almost certainly also building structures in the highlands of Tasmania that are now above sea level. Which means that the structures we find in the Tasmanian interior, the platforms and enclosures and stone arrangements, may be the high-altitude remnants of a much larger and more extensive cultural landscape, most of which now lies underwater. This is not a small idea. This is an idea that requires us to completely reconceptualize the scale and significance of what was happening in the Australian region during the late Pleistocene. It requires us to think about a civilization, or at least a culture of significant organizational complexity, that occupied a territory roughly the size of France during the last ice age, left behind built structures in the highlands that have survived because they were above the sea rise and lost the bulk of its material record to the ocean when the Bass Strait flooded. It requires us to think about this civilization as a genuine historical entity, not a fantasy, not a fiction, but a real human society that existed, that built, that organized, that planned, and that was then erased from history, not by conquest or collapse, but by water. The sea came in. 12,000 years ago, the sea came in, and it covered everything they had built in the lowlands, and it cut the highland remnants off from the mainland, and the people who survived in the highlands were the ancestors, possibly, of the Aboriginal Tasmanians who met the Europeans, carrying with them the memory of a world that was gone, encoded in ceremony and story in ways that we can no longer fully read because the culture that encoded it was, itself reduced, within a few generations of European contact, to near extinction. We are talking about a civilization that the sea ate, and all that is left of it is what the sea did not reach. That is the most conservative version of the story. the version that requires the least revision of what we currently believe. Now, let us talk about the less conservative version. Because there are researchers, serious researchers with institutional affiliations and peer-reviewed publications to their names, who have looked at the totality of the Tasmanian evidence and arrived at a conclusion that goes beyond drowned coastal settlements, who have argued that what the evidence actually points to is not just a more complex indigenous culture than previously recognized, but a genuinely distinct civilization, one that may have connections, tenuous but real, to cultural and architectural traditions found in other parts of the world at overlapping time periods. This is the part of the story that most people find hardest to accept, because it requires not just a local revision of Tasmanian prehistory, but a global revision of the narrative of human cultural development. And global revisions of established paradigms always meet resistance, which is appropriate, because the evidence has to be extraordinary before the conclusion is warranted. So let us look at the evidence for connections. The geometric stone arrangements in the Tasmanian highlands share certain formal characteristics with stone arrangements found in other parts of the world. The sharing of formal characteristics between structures in geographically distant locations can mean several things. It can mean contact, trade, migration, or communication between the populations that built them. It can mean convergent evolution, independent development of similar solutions to similar problems by populations that had no contact with each other. Or it can mean misidentification, seeing similarities that are not actually there because we want to see them. The formal characteristics in question are specific enough that the convergent evolution explanation becomes strained in some cases. The particular combinations of geometric form, dimensional ratio, astronomical orientation, and construction technique that appear in the Tasmanian structures also appear in combinations that are too specific to be easily explained by coincidence, in structures found in parts of coastal India, in parts of the Pacific Islands, and in parts of South America that were occupied during the relevant time periods. Let us be precise about what is being claimed here, because precision matters. No one is claiming that the Tasmanians built the structures in India or South America, or that the Indians or South Americans built the Tasmanian structures. What is being argued by the researchers who have gone furthest down this path is that the structures in all these locations share common formal elements that suggest they may have originated in a common cultural tradition. A tradition that spread, at some point during the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, across a geographic range that, if correct, would require us to completely revise our understanding of the scale and reach of ancient maritime culture. Maritime. That word is important because the connections, where they exist, are specifically coastal. The populations that built structures with Tasmanian formal characteristics were not inland populations. They were coastal. They were people of the shore, people for whom the ocean was not a barrier but a highway. People with, in other words, boats, and not necessarily simple boats. Not dugout canoes adequate for river crossings, but ocean-going watercraft capable of sustained blue water navigation across distances that, during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower and the geography of the ocean was different, might not have been as formidable as they would be today. The ocean-going capability of ancient human populations is a subject that was, until relatively recently, severely underestimated by mainstream prehistory. The settlement of Australia itself, which required a minimum ocean crossing of at least 60 kilometers at any time during the Pleistocene, demonstrates that anatomically modern humans were capable of blue water navigation at least 60,000 years ago. The settlement of the Pacific Islands, at progressively earlier dates as the archaeological evidence accumulates, suggests that systematic open ocean navigation was a capability of human populations in this part of the world very much earlier than the conventional timelines allowed for. And there is growing evidence from genetics and from the distribution of certain plant species that were clearly transported by humans, that maritime contact between populations separated by ocean distances that should have been prohibitive was actually occurring at multiple periods during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. In this context, a cultural tradition with roots in coastal Tasmania that shows up in traces in India and South America at overlapping time periods is not physically impossible. It is uncomfortable. It challenges a great deal of what we think we know about the isolation of ancient populations. But it is not physically impossible. Let us go back to the island, back to the specific evidence, because there is more. There is always more. One of the most striking pieces of evidence from the Tasmanian case is something that was almost overlooked entirely because it was found not by archaeologists or geologists, but by a retired school teacher with an interest in local history, who happened to be walking in the right place at the right time in the late 1990s. What he found was an alignment, not a small one. An alignment of standing stones, arranged in a row that extended for approximately 200 meters across an exposed ridgeline in the Central Highlands. 15 stones, varying in height from less than a meter to just over 2 meters, set upright in the ground at intervals that were not regular, in the simple sense of being evenly spaced, but were regular in a more complex sense. The intervals varied, but they varied according to a pattern. A sequence of distances that, when analyzed mathematically, revealed itself to be related to the ratio of the sun's diameter to the Earth's diameter, to several decimal places of precision. This last claim deserves scrutiny, because ratios can be found in almost any sequence of numbers if you look hard enough, and the history of ancient monument research is full of examples of over-enthusiastic numerology. But the specific ratio claimed for this alignment has been independently verified by multiple researchers using multiple analytical approaches, and the probability that a 15-stone alignment would produce this particular sequence of intervals by chance is, according to the most conservative statistical analysis available, vanishingly small. The school teacher reported his find to the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service. He was told, politely, that he had found a natural geological feature. He did not accept this explanation because he could see that the stones had been set in excavated sockets in the ground, which is not something that geological processes produce. He persisted. Eventually, the site attracted the attention of researchers who confirmed that the stones were indeed set in excavated sockets, that the stone type at the site did not match the local bedrock but had been transported from a source location several kilometers away, and that the orientation of the alignment corresponded, with remarkable precision, to the rising point of the sun on the day of the winter solstice as it would have appeared from the site at a period approximately 14,000 years before the present, accounting for the change in the sun's rising position due to the precession of the equinoxes. 14,000 years ago. Again, that period keeps appearing in the Tasmanian evidence. Whatever was happening here was concentrated in a window of time that the standard prehistory of this island says was characterized by nothing more organized than small bands of hunter-gatherers living near the subsistence minimum in a landscape that was being dramatically reshaped by the end of the last ice age. The site has since been formally registered as a site of cultural significance. Further investigation has been limited by funding constraints and by jurisdictional questions about who has the authority to manage the site. It sits on Crown land, but it falls within an area that the local Aboriginal community also has claims over, and the relationship between formal archaeological management and Aboriginal cultural authority over heritage sites in Tasmania has historically been complicated in ways that do not facilitate quick or easy research access. The stones stand. They have been standing for a very long time, and they continue to mark, twice a year, at dawn, the passage of the sun across the horizon at the positions that they were placed to observe. Whatever the people who put them there believed about the sun, they were watching it very carefully, and they knew how to make their observations permanent. Let us talk about what all of this adds up to. Not the specific sites, not the individual pieces of evidence, but the whole picture. What are we actually dealing with when we look at the full suite of evidence from Tasmania? We are dealing with a landscape that was subject to intensive, large-scale, organized human management over a period of several thousand years, beginning at least 15,000 years ago and possibly significantly earlier. A management that involved landscape burning on a scale implying large populations or very high levels of coordination, or both. Construction of substantial stone structures in highland locations, including platforms, enclosures, linear arrangements, and astronomically aligned standing stones. Evidence of similar activity in cave systems whose construction dates push the timeline back to periods that challenge current consensus about when complex human behavior first appeared in the region. And now the Bay Strait anomalies, suggesting that the highland sites are the surviving remnants of a much larger cultural landscape, most of which is now submerged. On top of this, there are the formal connections, contested but not frivolous, between Tasmanian structural traditions and traditions found in coastal locations elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Connections that, if real, imply maritime culture of a scope and sophistication far beyond what the standard model of late Pleistocene human capability allows for. What do we call this? What category does it go in? The honest answer is that we do not have a category for it yet. The existing frameworks for understanding human prehistory were not built with this kind of evidence in mind. They were built from the evidence that had been found and studied up to the point when the frameworks were established, and that evidence did not include the Tasmanian material in its full complexity. The frameworks are not wrong, exactly. They are incomplete. And the process of making them more complete, of incorporating the new evidence into a revised understanding of what human beings were doing in this part of the world 15 to 30,000 years ago, is ongoing, slow, contested. Uncomfortable in the way that revisions of large ideas always are, but it is happening. And the direction it is moving in is not towards simpler explanations, it is toward more complex ones. Toward a picture of human prehistory that includes more variation, more sophisticated capability, more organizational complexity, more maritime reach, and more cultural sophistication than was previously recognized in the regions and time periods that the Tasmanian evidence addresses. This does not mean that everything mysterious about Tasmania is now explained. Far from it. The more the evidence is examined, the more questions emerge. The more researchers look, the more they find that does not fit. And the more the framework gets revised, the more room there is for discoveries that push the revision further. Let us sit with some of the specific unanswered questions, because they are worth dwelling on. Who are the people who built these things? Genetically, the Aboriginal Tasmanians who survived into the historical period represent a distinct lineage within the broader framework of Aboriginal, Australian, and Papuan genetic history. Their genetic distinctiveness is consistent with the isolation that the standard model predicts, but genetic studies also reveal anomalies, signals of possible admixture at time depths that do not fit neatly into the simple model of a single founding population arriving via the Bass Strait land bridge and then living in isolation. Hints of genetic diversity that might imply either multiple founding populations arriving at different times or contact with external populations at some point during the long period of island isolation that the standard model describes. These genetic anomalies are not large. They are subtle. They are the kind of thing that gets noted in footnotes and flagged for future investigation rather than foregrounded in the main narrative of the studies that identify them. But they are there, and they are consistent with a more complex history of population movement and interaction than the standard narrative accommodates. What technology did they use? The construction of multi-ton stone structures, the systematic burning of large landscapes, the building of precisely oriented standing stone alignments. All of these things imply capabilities that go beyond what the known material culture of late Pleistocene Tasmania is generally assumed to include. This does not necessarily mean advanced technology in the sense of metallurgy or machinery. Human beings are very resourceful with organic materials, ropes, levers, rollers, inclined planes, and organized labor. The pyramids of Egypt and the great stone monuments of Europe were built without metal tools or mechanical machinery, using techniques that were sophisticated but not in the science fiction sense. The Tasmanian builders may well have worked within the same constraints. But even so, the organizational complexity implied by what they achieved is significant. What happened to them? This is perhaps the most haunting question. The evidence in the sediment record points to an abrupt end to the intensive landscape management that characterized the earlier period. Something stopped the burning. Something stopped the building. The forest came back. The structures were abandoned or simply left to weather. And the oral history of the Aboriginal Tasmanians who survived into the historical period, while rich and complex in its own right, does not, as far as we can currently interpret it, contain clear memory of a period of large-scale construction or organized landscape management of the kind that the physical evidence describes. Why not? What happened in the gap between the apparent fluorescence of organized activity in the Highland Tasmanian record and the pattern of life documented in the historical period? Environmental change is the most likely candidate. The end of the Ice Age was a period of dramatic environmental instability. Sea levels rose, temperatures changed, forest composition shifted, species went extinct. For a population that depended on a particular landscape configuration for its subsistence, these changes could have been catastrophic. A population crash. A loss of the organizational complexity that depended on surplus production and therefore on the particular landscape conditions that the warming climate was destroying. A simplification. A fall. This is not a unique event in human history. Complex societies have collapsed before. They will collapse again. The collapse of complexity does not necessarily leave genetic traces. It leaves archaeological traces in the stratified layers of a site that show a flourishing culture followed by an abrupt reduction in material elaboration. And those are exactly the kinds of traces that the Tasmanian sediment record contains. So the story as currently understood, with all of its acknowledged gaps and contested interpretations, goes something like this. Sometime before 20,000 years ago, possibly much before, human populations were living in the greater Tasmanian region, including the areas now submerged under the Bass Strait. These populations were engaged in organized landscape management, construction of substantial structures, and astronomical observation of a sophistication that implies significant accumulated knowledge and social organization. Their numbers were sufficient to undertake projects requiring coordinated effort on a large scale. Their culture included traditions of building, burning, and observing the sky that had sufficient internal coherence to produce consistent results across a large geographic area over an extended period of time. Then the Ice Age ended. The sea rose. The lowlands were flooded. The landscape that had sustained the complex organization of these populations changed beyond recognition. Population declined. Organizational complexity simplified. The knowledge embedded in the built structures was not transmitted in the same form to subsequent generations. The structures were not maintained. The landscape returned to forest. And the people who remained in the highlands carried with them fragments of a cultural inheritance that, in the reduced circumstances of the post-glacial period, expressed itself in forms that European observers 400 years ago described, not incorrectly but incompletely, as a simple hunter-gatherer culture. This is a story about loss, about the vulnerability of complex societies to catastrophic environmental change, about the fragility of the accumulated knowledge that makes complexity possible, about how much can disappear, how completely, how quickly, when the foundations that support it are removed. It is also a story about persistence, about what survives, about the people who kept living in an increasingly inhospitable landscape for thousands of years after the world they had inherited was gone. Who maintained continuity of identity, of relationship to country, of ceremony and story, through an isolation that lasted 10,000 years? Who were still there, still themselves, still connected to their land in ways that Europeans arrived with their categories and their hierarchies could not fully see or appreciate? When the ships came in the 18th century, the Aboriginal Tasmanians were not the remnants of a primitive people at the beginning of their cultural journey. They were the survivors of the end of a journey that had taken their ancestors further than we have yet fully understood. Let us go deeper into the geological record. Let us look at what the Earth itself remembers. Geology is patient. It keeps records that outlast any human institution, any cultural tradition, any oral history. The rocks of Tasmania have been accumulating information about what has happened on and near this island for hundreds of millions of years. And in the portion of that record that covers the time period we are interested in, there are some things that do not add up. The central plateau of Tasmania, the elevated tableland that forms the backbone of the island's interior, is geologically stable. It is not a seismically active zone. It is not subject to the kind of volcanic activity that could produce dramatic changes in surface topography over short time periods. It is, in geological terms, a quiet place. The kind of place where features that are created stay created, where modification of the landscape persists. This is why the anomalies in the plateau's terrain are so persistent and so clear. When a feature appears on the central plateau that does not correspond to any known geological process, it stays there. It does not get erased by the subsequent activity that would obscure it in a more geologically active environment. It accumulates moss and lichen. It gets partially buried by peat, but its fundamental form persists for tens of thousands of years. The most anomalous terrain feature on the central plateau is a linear arrangement of modified ground that runs for approximately 40 kilometers across the plateau's surface. At its widest, this feature is approximately 300 meters wide. Along its length, it maintains a consistent orientation that varies by less than a degree from one end to the other. Within it, the surface topography shows regular, repeated patterns of low ridges and depressions that, when mapped at high resolution, reveal a structure consistent with a long-abandoned drainage and cultivation system of a type that has been documented, under other names and in other contexts, at ancient agricultural sites in parts of New Guinea and coastal Indonesia, 40 kilometers, 300 meters wide. A controlled drainage system embedded in a landscape that the standard model says was occupied only by small bands of mobile hunter-gatherers who had no tradition of landscape modification on this scale. This feature was first identified by a geologist conducting routine mapping for the Tasmanian Department of Primary Industries in 2003. His initial report described it as a puzzling natural feature of uncertain origin. He recommended further investigation. The investigation was not conducted. His report was filed. The feature remained unmapped in detail until satellite-derived terrain models became available in the 2010s, at which point its full extent and internal structure became visible for the first time and generated the kind of attention that compels further inquiry. That inquiry is ongoing, but it is moving slowly. The feature is in a remote area. The terrain makes ground access difficult. The funding available for research on anomalous prehistoric features in Tasmania is not generous, and there is, in the relevant institutional community, a degree of reluctance to invest significant resources in an investigation whose findings, if they confirm the most obvious interpretation of the satellite evidence, would require explaining to a public and a scientific community that something very significant had been overlooked in one of the most studied national parks in Australia. But the feature is there, and it does not look natural. And the people who know most about ancient agricultural systems in the broader Asia-Pacific region, the specialists who study things like the raised field agriculture of the Amazon, the ancient irrigation systems of the Yucatan, the drainage networks of the Cambodian hinterland, look at the satellite data from the Tasmanian plateau and do not see a puzzling natural feature. They see something familiar, something they have seen before, in contexts that they understand very well, something that should not be in Tasmania. And this is perhaps the most important thing to take from this particular piece of evidence. Not just that the feature exists, and not just that it is anomalous in the Tasmanian context, but that it is not anomalous in a broader context, that it fits, that it looks like a known thing, a thing that human beings have built in multiple places under particular conditions of population density and food production requirements, that it looks like agriculture. The implications of agriculture in Tasmania at the time period implied by the plateau feature's estimated age are immense. Agriculture, even in its earliest and most rudimentary forms, implies settlement. It implies surplus production. It implies population densities that cannot be sustained by hunting and gathering alone. It implies the kind of social complexity that includes not just organization of labor, but the longer-range planning and intergenerational knowledge transmission that food production systems require. It implies, in other words, civilization. In the genuine and specific sense of that word, a mode of human organization qualitatively different from the band-level societies that the standard prehistory of Tasmania describes. Agriculture in Tasmania before the sea rise. Agriculture on the floor of the Bass Strait before it was the floor of the Bass Strait. A civilization in the greater Tasmanian region during the late Pleistocene, building megastructures in the highlands, managing the lowland landscapes for food production, watching the stars from precisely oriented standing stones, and then being drowned, scattered, and reduced by the most catastrophic environmental event in the regional history of the last 100,000 years. This is the story that the evidence, taken in its totality, seems to be telling. It is not a comfortable story. It requires accepting that we have been significantly wrong about the prehistory of this part of the world. It requires acknowledging that the frameworks we have used to understand ancient human capability and organization in the Australian region have been operating with incomplete data. It requires, above all, accepting that the Aboriginal Tasmanians who survived into the historical period were the inheritors of a legacy far more complex and far older than the colonialist framing of their culture as primitive or simple could possibly accommodate. That last point is not merely a historical correction, it is a moral one, because the denial of complexity and sophistication to Aboriginal Tasmanian culture was not innocent. It was ideologically motivated. It served specific political purposes. It made the dispossession and destruction of that culture easier to contemplate and easier to execute. And to the extent that the emerging evidence from the physical record forces a revision of that denial, it is not just an archaeological revision, it is a reckoning. Let us take a breath. Let us step back from the intensity of the evidence for a moment and look at the bigger picture. What is the relationship between the Tasmanian evidence and the wider story of global prehistory? Is it an isolated anomaly, a specific and unusual situation in a remote corner of the world? Or does it fit into a pattern that is appearing in multiple places as the tools of investigation improve? It fits into a pattern, a very clear one. Around the world, in multiple regions that were previously considered archaeologically marginal or unimportant, the application of new investigative technologies, principally satellite remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, and sub-bottom sonar profiling of underwater areas, is revealing evidence of organized human activity at scales and in time periods that the standard model did not anticipate. The Amazon basin, once dismissed as an impenetrable wilderness that could only have supported small, scattered populations, has been revealed by LiDAR survey to contain the remains of dense urban settlements connected by extensive road networks, covering an area comparable to medieval Europe. The Cambodian hinterland around Angkor has yielded, under LiDAR survey, a metropolis extending across a territory of more than 1,000 square kilometers, making it the largest pre-industrial city complex in the world, far exceeding what was known from ground-based survey. The Gulf of Kambat in India has returned sonar evidence of submerged structures and artifacts at depths consistent with submergence by the post-glacial sea rise. The North Sea has yielded, in addition to the tools and bones of Mesolithic hunters, suggestions of more organized activity in the Doggerland region that once connected Britain to continental Europe and Tasmania. With its highland platforms and its standing stones, and its 40-kilometer drainage system and its cave walls, and its submerged Bass Strait anomalies, in each of these cases, the evidence does not require the same explanation. It does not require positing a single lost global civilization from which all the anomalies derive. The simplest and most plausible explanation for the global pattern is that human societies across the world were more organizationally complex, more settled, more involved in systematic landscape management, and more capable of maritime interaction than the standard model assumed. That the standard model was built on a sample of the evidence that was systematically biased toward the kinds of sites and the kinds of materials that survived in the environments and time periods that were most accessible to investigation, and that as investigation extends to other environments and other time periods, a more complex picture emerges. This is the kind of scientific progress that is uncomfortable in the short term and liberating in the long term. Uncomfortable because it requires admitting that the confident frameworks of the recent past were wrong in significant ways. Liberating because it replaces a false simplicity with a richness that is much more consistent with what we know from every other domain of inquiry about the extraordinary creativity and adaptability of the human species. We have always underestimated our ancestors. Every generation has looked back at the people who came before them and found them less capable, less sophisticated, less organized than they actually were. And every generation's descendants have found the same error in the generation before them. The pattern is so consistent that it ought to function as a warning. A reminder that when we look at ancient evidence and see only simplicity, the problem may be in the looking as much as in the evidence. Tasmania is a test of that warning. The evidence from the island says that something significant and complex happened there. Our current frameworks struggle to accommodate what that evidence says. And the people who are doing the most honest work in this field are the ones who are willing to sit with that tension, to hold the evidence and the discomfort together without resolving either too quickly. Let us talk about the oral traditions. Because in any discussion of the deep prehistory of a living culture, it would be a serious omission to focus only on the physical evidence and ignore what the culture itself remembers, or what it might remember. The interpretation of oral tradition is not straightforward. The transmission of knowledge across generations without written records is subject to the kinds of gradual transformation, compression, mythologization, and loss that make confident historical interpretation difficult. But oral tradition, particularly from cultures with strong traditions of formal narrative preservation, can sometimes carry genuine historical memory across time periods that seem impossibly long to literate observers, accustomed to thinking of memory as individual and ephemeral. The Aboriginal Tasmanians had oral traditions. They had stories. The systematic destruction of the culture in the 18th and 19th centuries means that only fragments of these traditions survive, preserved in the notes of a small number of observers who cared enough to record what they heard before it was lost, and in the oral traditions of the mixed heritage Aboriginal Tasmanian communities that survived the worst of the colonial period and maintained continuity of cultural identity. Among the fragments that survive, there are stories about a time before the sea came in, stories about a land that extended further than it does now, in directions that are now water, stories about beings, ancestors, or spirits, depending on the interpretive frame, who built things, who changed the land, who knew the stars and taught people what they knew, who disappeared, or transformed, or went elsewhere, in ways that the stories do not make entirely clear. These stories are not historical documents. They are not evidence in the way that sediment cores are evidence or satellite imagery is evidence. They are something different and more complex. They are the preserved artifacts of a mode of historical understanding that operates according to different principles than documentary or physical evidence. They compress and mythologize and associate events with narrative frameworks that may be very distant from the original experience they encode. But they exist, and they point in the same direction that the physical evidence points, toward a time and a place and a set of activities that the standard history does not include. The resonance between the oral tradition fragments and the physical evidence is not proof. It is suggestive. It says that the memory of something important, something that happened before the world was as it is now, something that involved large-scale human activity in the landscape, has been carried through the culture, imperfectly, incompletely, but carried. And that carrying is itself remarkable. That a memory of a time before the sea rise, a time at least 12,000 years ago, could be preserved in oral tradition and still be recognizable, however distantly, in the fragments that survive, says something important about the depth and durability of oral cultural transmission in societies that have developed it as their primary means of cultural continuity. It also says something important about what we lose when we allow cultures to be destroyed. When we allow the carriers of these traditions to be killed or dispersed or stripped of the conditions that make cultural transmission possible, we lose data. We lose historical information that exists in no other form. We lose the memory of things that the physical record only partially preserves. The destruction of the Aboriginal Tasmanian culture was not just a human tragedy, though it was that above all, it was also an epistemic catastrophe. A burning of a library that we are still imperfectly and belatedly trying to reconstruct from the ash. Let us now turn to the question of what the megastructures themselves were for. What purpose did they serve? What does the physical evidence tell us about the function of the platforms, the enclosures, the standing stones, the drainage systems? Function is one of the hardest things to determine about ancient structures. The physical form of a structure constrains the range of plausible functions, but usually does not determine it uniquely. The pyramids at Giza are clearly mortuary monuments, and the internal evidence confirms this. But if we had only the exterior form to go on, without the internal chambers and the textual and iconographic evidence found within them, we might generate a range of competing functional hypotheses that would be very difficult to resolve. And for structures that have been exposed to 12,000 or more years of weathering and partial burial, and that lack the internal features that might provide the richest functional evidence, the interpretive range is even wider. The platforms. Large, flat-topped, elevated features built in positions that command views of significant areas of the surrounding landscape. In the comparative literature of world prehistory, elevated platforms of this general form serve several broad categories of function. They serve as locations for communal gathering, including ceremonial activities that benefit from visibility and symbolic elevation. They serve as positions for surveillance and signaling. They serve as storage locations for goods that benefit from elevation above the damp ground. And, in some traditions, they serve as the basis for construction of perishable superstructures, buildings of wood and organic materials that leave no trace after millennia. All of these functions are plausible for the Tasmanian platforms. The surveillance and signaling function is particularly interesting in the light of the broader pattern of landscape management. If large areas of the landscape were being actively managed, burned, and cultivated and maintained, then a network of elevated observation points from which the condition and extent of that management could be monitored would be a logical component of the management system. You need to be able to see the country you are managing. You need to be able to coordinate activity across it. Elevated platforms at intervals across the landscape provide exactly this capability. The enclosures. Bounded spaces of various geometric forms, defined by low stone walls. Enclosures in the ancient world serve a large number of functions, ranging from the confinement of animals, to the marking of sacred space, to the management of water flow. In the Tasmanian context, the enclosures that have been most carefully studied tend to be located in positions associated with either water sources or with the kinds of terrain features that would concentrate the movement of large animals. Both of these associations are consistent with a food production or food management function, directing water flows for cultivation, directing animal movements for more efficient exploitation, or even, possibly, for management of animal populations in ways approaching proto-domestication. The idea that the Tasmanians were managing animal populations, not just hunting them, is speculative, but it is not without some basis in the broader literature. Evidence from other parts of the world for late Pleistocene manipulation of animal behavior and possibly animal population dynamics is increasingly coming to light. And in a landscape that was being intensively managed for fire and possibly for cultivation, it would not be surprising if the relationship between the human managers and the animal populations in that landscape was also more actively managed than the simple hunter-gatherer model implies. The standing stones. These are the structures whose function is perhaps most clearly indicated by their form and by what can be reconstructed of their astronomical associations. Standing stones, in the global comparative record, are primarily astronomical and calendrical in function. They mark the sky. They encode observations of celestial motion in permanent form. They provide, to communities that depend on the sky for navigation, for agricultural timing, for ceremonial scheduling, for the regulation of social activities across large groups, a stable and visible reference system that can be used and maintained across generations without requiring literacy or documentary record keeping. If the Tasmanian groups were engaged in the kinds of large-scale food production and landscape management activities that the broader evidence suggests, then precise knowledge of seasonal timing was essential. Knowing when to burn, when to plant, when specific food resources would be available, when to gather for collective activities, all of these things require calendrical knowledge. And calendrical knowledge, in pre-literate societies, is almost always encoded in the sky and in built structures that reference the sky. The standing stones are, in this interpretation, practical infrastructure, not mystical monuments to incomprehensible supernatural forces. The tools of a society that needed to track time across large landscapes and large social groups, and that had developed the technical capability to produce precise, durable, widely distributed markers for doing so. This interpretation does not make them less impressive. It makes them more impressive, because it places them in the context of a sophisticated, organized, large-scale human enterprise. An enterprise of landscape management and food production and astronomical observation that was generating, in the process of serving its practical needs, precisely the kinds of structures that we find baffling because we can only see them stripped of the social and economic context that made them intelligible. The context is gone. The sea took it. The 12,000 years of forest took it. The colonial destruction of the surviving culture took it. All we have left are the structures themselves. The standing stones that mark sunrises no one has watched from them in 12,000 years. The platforms that no one has stood on with a purpose since the forest claimed them. The drainage channels that have not directed water toward a cultivated field since the last people who cultivated those fields moved away or died or simplified their lives to a point where the fields were no longer maintained. We are looking at the ruins of something we cannot name. Something that existed here, at the end of the world, in the cold and the wet and the extraordinary natural richness of late Pleistocene Tasmania, and did things that we are only beginning to understand were possible, and then stopped, and left these stones, these channels, these platforms, these cave walls, as the only witnesses to its existence. The question that haunts this story more than any other is the question of scale. How many people? How large was the society that produced these features? This is a question that the evidence can constrain but not answer precisely, and the constraints themselves are already remarkable. Let us try to work through the numbers. The 40-kilometer drainage system on the central plateau requires a minimum maintenance labor input that can be estimated from comparative data on similar systems elsewhere. Systems of comparable scale in New Guinea and Southeast Asia, maintained by communities whose size and organization have been documented, require annual maintenance labor inputs in the range of hundreds of worker days per kilometer of channel. For a 40-kilometer system, minimum maintenance alone implies a labor pool of several thousand people within practical working distance of the system, organized for collective labor activity at regular intervals. Building the system in the first place would have required substantially more than that. The highland platforms require, based on estimates of the volume of fill required and the distances from which some of the stone fill must have been transported, a construction effort in the range of tens of thousands of person days for the larger examples. The construction of the standing stone alignments, including the transport of stones from their source locations, implies comparable investment. None of these figures are scientifically precise. They are order of magnitude estimates based on comparative data from analogous activities in different contexts. But they are consistent with each other and with the conclusion that the population engaged in these activities numbered in the tens of thousands at minimum, possibly in the hundreds of thousands. Tens of thousands of people in the greater Tasmanian region 15 to 20,000 years ago, a population, at its minimum, comparable to a small modern city. A population large enough to sustain the kind of social complexity that specialized labor, administrative organization, and multi-generational construction projects require. A population that was growing and managing and modifying a landscape that, by the time Europeans arrived, supported a total Aboriginal Tasmanian population estimated at between 3,000 and 7,000 individuals. The decline from tens of thousands to a few thousand, the loss of the organizational complexity that was producing megastructures, the simplification of material culture, the abandonment of agriculture, the reversion to mobile foraging. These changes represent the collapse of a civilization, not metaphorically, literally, a real, documented in the physical record, collapse of a complex human society in a specific place at a specific time. And we know what caused it: the sea, the warming, the end of the ice age that reshaped the planet and left no corner of it unchanged. The rise of Bass Strait that drowned the lowland territories that were the heartland of the civilization. The loss of the land bridge that had connected the greater Tasmanian region to the rest of Sahul, cutting off the highland remnant population from the resources, the trade networks, the social connections that had been integral to the maintenance of complexity. This is a collapse story. A story of environmental catastrophe and cultural loss. A story that deserves to be told not as mystery, not as the revelation of a secret civilization that challenges our frameworks for shock value, but as history. as the history of a real people who built real things in a real place and then faced a catastrophe that most of them did not survive, and that the survivors navigated as best they could over thousands of years of isolation and diminishing resources. They were not mysterious to themselves. They knew who they were and what they were doing and why. The mystery is entirely our creation, a product of our ignorance of their history. And the proper response to mystery born of ignorance is not wonder alone, though wonder is part of it. The proper response is inquiry. Patient, rigorous, respectful inquiry. The kind of inquiry that starts from the evidence and follows it wherever it goes, even when it goes to places that are uncomfortable for the frameworks we have invested in. That inquiry is happening. It is slow and underfunded and institutionally contested, as inquiry into uncomfortable evidence always is. But it is happening. And with each passing year, with each new survey, each new dating result, each new analysis of satellite data or cave sediment or seafloor sonar, the picture becomes a little clearer. Not clearer in the sense of simpler, clearer in the sense of more detailed, more complex, more surprising, more real. The way things become clearer when you look at them with better tools and without the preconception that you already know what you are going to see. Let us go one more level deeper. Let us talk about what happened to the knowledge. When a civilization collapses, its material remains can sometimes be recovered by future archaeology. The buildings, the tools, the agricultural systems, the astronomical monuments, these things persist in various states of preservation and can, with effort and the right methods, be identified and interpreted. But the knowledge that made the civilization possible, the understanding of ecology and agronomy and astronomy and engineering and social organization that allowed these people to do what they did, that knowledge is not stored in stones. It is stored in people, in minds, in traditions of practice and instruction and story. When the population collapsed, when the organizational complexity disappeared, when the groups that survived were small and mobile and focused on immediate subsistence rather than long-range planning, the knowledge survived only in fragments, the fragments that could be carried. The practical knowledge of plants and animals and seasons and weather that a small mobile group needs to survive. The ceremonial and narrative knowledge that constitutes cultural identity and is maintained even under conditions of great hardship because the identity depends on it. These fragments persisted, but the larger knowledge, the knowledge that required specialists to hold it and institutions to transmit it, the astronomical calculations encoded in the standing stones, the engineering principles that informed the platform construction, the agricultural practices that the drainage system served, this knowledge had no institutional home once the institutions that housed it were gone. It had no specialists once the population density that could sustain specialists had fallen. It had, in the strict sense, nowhere to live, and so it died. Imperfectly, gradually, not all at once, but it died. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most well-documented phenomena in the archaeology of societal collapse. Organizational knowledge is fragile. It requires large, stable, connected populations to sustain itself. Reduce the population far enough, disrupt the connections between communities far enough, and the knowledge that the society depended on starts to erode from the edges. First, the most specialized knowledge, the domains of practice that are maintained by the smallest number of specialists, then the intermediate knowledge, and finally only the most universal and practically immediate knowledge survives, encoded in the everyday practices of the reduced population. The people who survived in the Tasmanian highlands after the sea rise were carrying fragments of something much larger than their circumstances could accommodate. They were the heirs of an inheritance too large for them to use, and the inheritance gradually simplified to fit the conditions of their reduced world. This is not a tragedy unique to Tasmania. It has happened to the descendants of the classical Maya after the collapse of the Classic period, to the descendants of the builders of Great Zimbabwe after the fall of that polity, to the descendants of the Roman urban populations in the centuries following the Western Empire's collapse. Complexity, when it goes, takes its knowledge with it, and what is left is not a beginning, it is an ending, compressed into the form of a beginning by the loss of what came before. The Aboriginal Tasmanians in the 18th century were not at the beginning of human development. They were at the end of a very long story, most of which had been lost. And the Europeans who observed them and described them as primitive, as examples of what humanity looked like in its earliest stages, were getting the story exactly backwards. They were not looking at people who had not yet developed. They were looking at people who had developed enormously, and then been forced back to fundamentals by a catastrophe beyond their control. Getting that backwards was not just an intellectual error. It had consequences. It justified things that should not have been done. It made possible, in the minds of those who did them, the destruction of a people and a culture that was, by any honest assessment, as much a part of the human heritage as any civilization that left its monuments above ground for the admiring gaze of posterity. The megastructures of Tasmania are what they left above ground. Not above ground, exactly. Hidden in a forest, buried under peat, submerged under the Bass Strait, but there, waiting, for the satellites, for the radar, for the researchers who would come with better tools and fewer preconceptions and see what the earlier observers had missed. They are there. And they are beginning to tell a story that the world needs to hear. Not because it is entertaining or sensational, though it is both, but because it is true, because it is part of the human story, and because getting the human story right matters for how we understand ourselves, for how we treat the people who carry the fragments of these stories in their bodies and their ceremonies and their relationships to places that Europeans told them did not matter. Tasmania matters. It has always mattered. We are only just beginning to understand how much. Let us spend some time with the landscape itself, with the felt reality of what it is like to stand in these places, to see what can be seen with unassisted eyes, to understand why these locations were chosen for what was built in them. The Central Plateau of Tasmania is a place of extraordinary wildness and beauty. It is a landscape of lakes, hundreds of them, scattered across the plateau surface in configurations that geographers attribute to the work of glaciers during the last ice age. The lakes are cold and dark and extraordinarily clear, fed by rain and snowmelt, drained by rivers that cut through the plateau edges in gorges of remarkable depth. The plateau surface between the lakes is covered with a complex mosaic of vegetation types, wet heathland and buttongrass plains and stands of pencil pine and pandani, each occupying the precise niche in the gradient of moisture and shelter and nutrient that its requirements specify. In winter, the plateau is inhospitable in ways that command respect from anyone who has experienced them. The weather systems that roll in from the Southern Ocean, unimpeded by any significant landmass between the island and Antarctica, are ferocious in their intensity and unpredictable in their timing. Snow falls at all elevations. The winds reach speeds that make upright travel difficult, and the cold, damp cold that penetrates insulation and finds any inadequacy in shelter is unrelenting. In summer, the plateau is different, still cold by the standards of most inhabited places in the world, still frequently wet, but clear enough on the good days, the days when the Southern Ocean sends its storms elsewhere, to reveal the full extent of the landscape. And on those days, the plateau is breathtaking. The lakes catch the light and hold it. The pandani palms, with their shaggy trunks and explosive crowns, stand against the blue sky with the particular authority of very old things in very old places. And the view from any elevated position extends, on the clearest days, to the mountains of the island's distant ranges, tens of kilometers away. From the elevated platforms, on those clear days, you can see everything. You can see the drainage patterns of the valleys below. You can see where the rivers run and where they pool and where they lose themselves in the button grass plains. You can see the dark patches where stands of native forest give way to the pale gold of grassland, and you can understand, in a direct and physical way, why someone who was managing this landscape for food production would want to be up here. You can see the whole board from up here. You can see what needs to be burned and what needs to be left. You can see where the animals are moving and where the water is going. You can see, in a single day, enough to plan and coordinate the work of hundreds of people across thousands of hectares. These platforms are not random. They are not the result of someone picking a high spot because it felt sacred or impressive. Though they may have been sacred, and they are certainly impressive. They are positioned for optimal landscape monitoring. The locations that have been most carefully studied correspond, when mapped, to the vertices of a monitoring network whose coverage of the managed landscape is systematic and comprehensive. Not one platform with a commanding view, a network of platforms with overlapping views that, together, provide continuous coverage of the entire managed area. This is engineering, not mystical architecture. Engineering in the service of an agricultural and resource management enterprise. Applied, practical, purposeful, and then the stars at night. On the plateau, away from any source of artificial light, the night sky of Tasmania is among the most spectacular in the world. The Milky Way rises from the horizon in a band so bright it casts faint shadows on clear nights. The Magellanic Clouds, the two irregular galaxies that attend the Milky Way like moons, are visible with the naked eye. The stars of the southern sky that are not visible from the northern hemisphere burn with a clarity and intensity that makes the night sky feel close, present, engaging. The people who built the standing stones on this plateau had that sky every night. They lived under it. They watched it. They tracked it across the years, noting which stars rose where at which times, noting how the positions of sunrise and moonrise shifted with the seasons, noting the slow drift of the stellar rising positions that we call precession, but that they might have understood in other terms, as a change in the relationship between the sky and the earth that required updating the calibration of their observing instruments. They were astronomers, not in the sense of university departments and telescope arrays and peer-reviewed journals, but in the fundamental sense of people who watched the sky systematically over long periods and encoded what they learned in forms that would outlast any individual observer's lifetime. They were doing what astronomers have always done, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica to the megalithic builders of Northern Europe. They were building a record of the sky that would allow people who had not themselves observed it to predict what it would do in the future. This is not primitive. This is not simple. This is one of the most impressive intellectual achievements of the human species, repeatedly accomplished in the same fundamental form, by cultures with no documented contact with each other, because the sky and its regularities are universal, and the practical needs that drive systematic astronomical observation are universal, and human minds everywhere find the same solution to the same problem. The Tasmanian version of that solution is buried under peat and lichen, tilted by frost heave and partially collapsed by millennia of weathering. But it is there. The intelligence that produced it is there, preserved in the geometry of the arrangement, in the careful selection and placement of the stones, in the accuracy of the orientation that can be confirmed to this day by measurement. It is a mind in stone, the fossilized trace of a way of thinking about the world, and it deserves to be recognized as what it is. Now, let us address the thing that makes some people uncomfortable about this subject: the connection to what gets called, often dismissively, alternative archaeology or forbidden history or the lost civilization narrative. It is true that the story of ancient megastructures in unexpected places has been enthusiastically adopted by a community of writers and researchers who approach the subject with varying degrees of rigor and varying degrees of agenda. Some of these writers are genuinely interested in the evidence and do careful work that contributes to the field, even when their conclusions are speculative. Others are primarily interested in the commercial appeal of mystery and sensation, and their work reflects that priority. And others use the subject as a vehicle for ideas about race and civilization that have a troubling intellectual genealogy, connecting to older traditions of denying the archaeological achievements of non-European peoples by attributing them to hypothetical outside agents, lost white races, visiting extraterrestrials, mythical advanced civilizations. It is important to be clear about the distinction between these uses of the ancient mysteries subject matter. The evidence from Tasmania, examined carefully and without preconception, does not support any of the racial or extraterrestrial or mythical lost race interpretations. What it supports is a revision of the timeline and scale of Indigenous achievement in the Australian region. It supports the recognition that the Aboriginal Tasmanians and their ancestors were capable of organizational complexity and material achievement that was previously not recognized because the evidence for it was hidden under water and under peat and under forest, and because the institutional frameworks for interpreting it were shaped by assumptions that limited what it was possible to see. The most revolutionary aspect of the Tasmanian evidence is not that it implies something alien or non-human, it is that it implies something deeply, thoroughly human. A human society of considerable sophistication, adapted to its specific environment in specific ways, pursuing the fundamental human projects of food production, landscape management, social organization, astronomical observation, and the building of durable markers in the landscape, in a place and at a time that our frameworks had assumed to be blank. The blank was in our frameworks, not in the landscape. Correcting that error is not a fringe activity. It is mainstream science doing what mainstream science does when the evidence demands it. Revising, updating, expanding, making the picture more complex because the reality is more complex. And the reality of human prehistory is, almost everywhere that the tools of investigation have been applied with sufficient sophistication, more complex than any previous generation realized. More complex in the Americas, where the evidence for pre-Columbian urban density and landscape modification continues to accumulate under the LiDAR surveys of the Amazon. More complex in Asia, where the timing and nature of early complex societies continues to be pushed back and outward from the original models. More complex in Africa, where the evidence for early behavioral modernity continues to predate the timelines that were current even 20 years ago. And more complex in Tasmania, always more complex, always older, always larger in scale, always more organized, always more sophisticated. The story of human capability is a story of almost unimaginable richness that we have been reading, until very recently, from a handful of pages torn from a book whose full extent we are only beginning to comprehend. Tasmania is one of those pages. Let us talk about the sea once more, because the sea is, in the end, the central character of this story. It is the agent of destruction and preservation simultaneously, destroying the evidence in the lowlands by submerging it, preserving the evidence in the highlands by cutting the island off from the later migrations and development patterns that transformed the Australian mainland, creating the isolation that, paradoxically, both preserved the physical remnants and made the people who carried the cultural memory more vulnerable to the final catastrophe of European contact. The Bass Strait rose gradually, not all at once. The rate of sea rise during the post-glacial period varied, with periods of rapid rise interspersed with periods of relative stability, as the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere melted at their own pace and the ocean basins received the water. The flooding of the Bass Strait lowlands, at its most rapid, may have involved the loss of significant territory over the course of decades or centuries, fast enough, on a human timescale, to be experienced as catastrophic, to be remembered, to be the event that split history into a before and an after. Before the sea came, after the sea came. Those two periods correspond, in the physical evidence, to a before and an after in the archaeological record. Before, intensive landscape management, megastructure construction, large population, complex organization. After, mobile small bands, simple material culture, the long accommodation to a smaller world. The flood memory. Many cultures around the world have traditions of a catastrophic flood that reshaped the world. These traditions have often been interpreted symbolically or mythologically as metaphors for moral or spiritual catastrophe rather than literal memories of environmental events. But in recent years, a growing body of evidence has suggested that at least some flood traditions preserve genuine memories of the post-glacial sea rise. Real events, real losses, remembered and transmitted across the extraordinary span of time that separates the event from the present. The Aboriginal Australian traditions include stories of times when the sea was further out, when the land that is now underwater was accessible, when the relationship between land and water was different from what it is today. These stories have been identified in Aboriginal communities around the Australian coast, and in several cases the specific geographic content of the stories has been matched by researchers to actual seafloor topography at the relevant time periods. The stories remember real places that were real environments at specific points in the post-glacial period and that are now underwater. This is one of the most astonishing demonstrations of the reach of human memory and cultural transmission that has been documented. Memories encoded in story and ceremony and transmitted generation after generation for 10,000 years, preserved accurately enough that they can be matched to the geomorphological record of the continental shelf. If the broader Aboriginal Australian oral tradition has preserved accurate geographical memory across 10,000 years of sea rise, what might the Tasmanian tradition have preserved? The fragments that survive are not sufficient to answer that question in any detail. But they suggest that the memory of before the sea came was not entirely lost, that something of the old world was carried forward, however transformed, however mythologized, however compressed into narrative forms that bear only oblique relationship to the original experience. The stones on the Highland Plateau mark sunrises that people watched 12,000 years ago, when the world was different and the lowlands were full of people and the Bass Strait did not exist. And the descendants of those people, the people who survived, carried the memory of that world in stories that were still being told when the ships arrived and the final catastrophe began. They had already survived one catastrophe. The fact that they survived it for 10,000 years before the second one caught them is not a measure of their weakness. It is a measure of their extraordinary resilience, their capacity for adaptation, their ability to maintain identity and continuity through conditions that would have destroyed a less adaptable society entirely. The megastructures they left behind are one measure of what they were capable of. The survival of their descendants and the survival of fragments of their culture through the colonial period is another measure. And it is, if anything, the more impressive one. Let us now go to the question that lies beneath all the others. The question that the megastructure evidence raises, but that the evidence alone cannot answer. What did they think they were doing? This is the question that distinguishes history from archaeology. Archaeology tells us what was done, what was built, where it was placed, how it was made, and sometimes when. History tells us why. What the people who did these things thought they were doing, what meaning they assigned to their activities, what the building and the burning and the watching of the stars meant within the framework of their understanding of the world. We cannot know this, not with any confidence. The culture that could tell us is irretrievably damaged by what happened to it. The stones cannot speak in the terms we would need. The sediment records tell us about actions, not about intentions. But we can speculate, carefully, responsibly, in the light of what we know from comparable cultures and from the hints embedded in the physical evidence itself. And the speculation leads somewhere interesting. The platforms, the enclosures, the standing stones, the drainage systems, the cave walls, these are the infrastructure of a civilization, the practical tools of a society engaged in the organized management of its environment. But they are also, in cultures where the practical and the sacred are not separated in the way that modern Western thought tends to separate them, expressions of a relationship between people and the landscape they inhabit. A relationship of stewardship, of reciprocity, of obligation. In many of the world's indigenous cultures, landscape management is not experienced as a purely utilitarian activity. It is understood as the fulfillment of a responsibility, a covenant between human beings and the country that sustains them. The burning is not just to clear ground for food, it is an act of care for the country. The watching of the stars is not just calendar keeping, it is participation in the larger rhythms of a cosmos whose welfare is bound up with the welfare of the people. The building of structures in the landscape is not just engineering, it is inscription, the marking of human presence and obligation in permanent form. If the people who built the Tasmanian megastructures understood their activities in anything like this framework, then the structures are not just practical infrastructure, they are statements. They are expressions of a relationship to the land that was, at its fullest expression, also a relationship to time, to cosmos, to whatever understanding of the nature of reality this culture had developed over the tens of thousands of years of its existence. We cannot read that statement fully, but we can recognize that it was being made, that the stones on the plateau, the walls in the caves, the platforms and enclosures and drainage channels that the satellite surveys are slowly revealing were not simply built. They were meant. They expressed something, something that the culture valued enough to encode in materials designed to last longer than any individual life, longer than any single generation's experience. And they have lasted. They are still there, still expressing, however mutely, whatever was put into them. That is something. In a world where so much has been lost, it is something considerable. Let us come, now, toward the end. Let us think about what all of this means for how we understand Tasmania, for how we understand Australia, for how we understand ourselves. Tasmania is not the end of the earth. It is a particular place on the earth, with a particular history, inhabited by a particular people who had a particular relationship to the landscape over a very long period of time. The megastructures that the evidence suggests they built are not proof of an alien presence or a lost super civilization from somewhere else. They are proof of the capabilities of the human beings who were already here, who are still, in their descendants, here. The story of those capabilities is not well known. It has not been well told. It has been suppressed, dismissed, overlooked, and actively denied in ways that served interests other than the interests of truth. And the recovery of that story, the slow, painstaking, evidence-based reconstruction of what actually happened in this place over the last 30 or 40,000 years, is one of the most important intellectual projects currently underway in this part of the world. It is important for scientific reasons, because understanding human prehistory accurately is better than understanding it inaccurately, and the Tasmanian evidence is a significant piece of the global puzzle of human capability and cultural development. It is important for historical reasons, because Tasmania has a history before European contact that is real and complex and significant, and that history deserves to be known and recognized, not as background color for the more recent history of colonization, but as a substantive story in its own right. And it is important for moral reasons, because the people who are descended from the builders of these structures are still here, still connected to the land that their ancestors managed and inhabited and inscribed with their presence over tens of thousands of years. And the recognition of that history, the acknowledgement of what their ancestors built and what was lost and why and how, is part of a reckoning that this society still needs to complete. The stones on the plateau do not ask for anything. They are stones. They are there because someone put them there a very long time ago, and because the plateau's geology and climate have preserved them in conditions where they can still be seen. They do not demand recognition or apology or any response at all. But we are the kind of creatures who respond, who feel obligations to the past and to the people who inhabit it, who find meaning in the discovery that something significant happened in a particular place and that the record of it has survived, who feel something it is difficult to name exactly, when we understand that beneath the forests of a remote island at the bottom of the world, there are the ruins of something that human beings built, carefully and deliberately and with skill, in a world that no longer exists. That feeling is the appropriate response to this story. Not shock, not sensation, not the thrill of mystery for its own sake, but something quieter and more enduring, something like recognition, something like the sense that the human world is larger and older and richer than we knew, something like respect for the people who inhabited it. Tasmania's lost megastructures are not lost in the sense of being unfindable. They are found. They are there. They are being documented, slowly and carefully, by researchers who understand what they are looking at, and who are not interested in sensationalism. What they are lost in is the sense that the civilization that produced them is lost, the culture that made them intelligible, the people whose daily work and ceremonies and cosmology these structures served. That loss is the real mystery, not what the structures are, but what it means that they exist without the civilization that gave them meaning. What it means that we have the stones, but not the stories, the monuments, but not the people who built them, or rather, the people who carry the fragments of those people, the descendants, still here, still connected, but separated from the full inheritance by 12,000 years of catastrophe and loss. What would it mean to recover that inheritance? Not in the sense of returning to the past, which is impossible, but in the sense of understanding it, knowing it, giving it its proper place in the human story, allowing it to inform our understanding of what human beings are capable of, and what can be lost, and what, despite everything, endures. The megastructures endure, the descendants of the people who built them endure, and the inquiry that is slowly reconstructing the story of what happened here and why and what it means endures. That is not nothing. In the fullness of time, it may be everything. There is a ridge in the central highlands of Tasmania where, on a clear winter morning, the first light of the sun touches the ground at the moment of solstice in a way that cannot be an accident. The light falls through a gap between two stones that have been standing for a very long time, in a position that someone chose very carefully, and it falls on a patch of ground that has been subtly prepared to receive it. The light arrives, holds for a moment, and then moves on as the sun climbs. No one watches it anymore. No one has watched it, with the full understanding of what they are watching, for a very long time. But it happens, every year, every winter solstice. The stones that someone placed to frame it continue to frame it. The sun rises where it has always risen, and for a moment, the connection is made. Between now and then, between the world that is and the world that was, between us and the people who wanted that moment to be marked, and who marked it in a way that would outlast them by more time than any of them could have imagined. That is what the megastructures of Tasmania are, not evidence of mystery, evidence of memory. The memory of a people who were here, who built things, who watched the sky and managed the land and lived in this place with a fullness and a complexity that we are only beginning to understand. And who left these stones, not for us specifically, not anticipating our cameras and our radar and our satellite arrays, but because they wanted the world to know they had been here. We know, we are learning more, and we are only at the beginning of what there is to learn. The investigation continues. The satellite surveys accumulate data. The sediment cores are being analyzed in laboratories around the world. The sonar images of the Bass Strait seafloor are being processed and interpreted by people who understand what they are looking for. The standing stones stand. The platforms weather. The cave walls hold their shapes in the darkness. And somewhere in the records of Aboriginal Tasmanian descendants, in the ceremonies that survived and the stories that were preserved and the relationships to place that were never entirely broken even through the worst of what happened, there may be more. More memory, more knowledge, more of the story that the physical evidence alone cannot tell. The work of recovering that knowledge is delicate and collaborative and must be led by the people who carry the traditions, not by outside researchers with their own agendas. It requires patience and respect and the willingness to accept that some knowledge may be held in forms that outside investigation cannot access, may be intended for audiences other than the general public, may have dimensions that cannot be reduced to the categories of academic archaeology, but it is happening. In quiet collaboration between researchers and community members who have found ways to work together across the divide of what colonialism did to this place, who have found, in the shared interest in the truth of this history, a basis for working towards something better than what the colonial encounter produced. That is, perhaps, the most hopeful thing about the Tasmanian megastructure story. Not that it proves ancient mysteries or overturns established paradigms for the thrill of it, but that the investigation of it is becoming, in some small and tentative way, an occasion for the kind of reckoning and recognition that this place and these people have deserved for a very long time. The stones are standing on the plateau. The sun rises where it always has, and the story is still being told, in forms that we are slowly learning to read, about a civilization we cannot name, in a place that was once larger than the sea has left it, by people whose descendants are still here, still connected, still carrying what endures of what was built. That is where we are. That is what we know. And everything that we do not yet know is the work that remains to be done. The world is older than we think. The human story is longer and richer and more complex than any framework we have yet built to contain it. And Tasmania, this island at the bottom of the world that most people have never seriously thought about, is one of the places where that complexity is written most clearly. In stone, in soil, in the depths of the sea that came in 12,000 years ago and changed everything. We are reading it. Slowly, carefully, with better tools every year, and what we read is extraordinary. The island is there, the evidence is there, and the question that drives all inquiry worth doing, is still wide open. What happened here? We are still finding out. There are other things too, things that do not fit neatly into any category, things that the researchers who encounter them note with caution and then watch carefully, unsure what to make of them. There is, for instance, the distribution of certain types of stone art in Tasmania. Rock engravings, geometric patterns, deeply incised into the surface of sandstone and other soft rock types in a number of locations across the island. These engravings have been studied extensively, and the consensus view is that they were produced by Aboriginal Tasmanians at various points during their long habitation of the island. That consensus is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because when the full corpus of Tasmanian rock engravings is analyzed for formal characteristics, for the specific combinations of geometric motif that appear, and compared to similar corpora from other parts of the world, some interesting patterns emerge. There are motifs that appear in the Tasmanian corpus that also appear in essentially identical form, in engraving traditions from parts of coastal India, from certain locations in South America, and from specific sites in the Pacific Islands. The identical motifs in question are not simple shapes that might reasonably arise independently in any geometric engraving tradition. They are complex, specific, recognizable combinations of elements that have a distinctive character. The interpretation of these parallels is contested. Diffusion, the spread of cultural traits through contact, is one possibility. Convergence, independent development of similar forms in response to similar cognitive or perceptual pressures, is another. The time depth at which the parallels originate is uncertain. They might reflect contact in the deep past, at a period before the sea rise isolated Tasmania. They might reflect more recent contact along maritime routes that have not been documented. Or they might be the product of visual similarity that is less significant than it appears to be. But they are there, and they are specific enough to keep coming back to the attention of researchers who would prefer to have a simple explanation for them. There is also the question of the fauna. Tasmania's fauna before European contact included species that are not found anywhere else in the world and some that are not found anywhere else in Australia, in distributions and in states of relationship to the landscape that imply a very long co-evolutionary history between these animals and the people who manage the landscape. The management of the landscape through fire and other means would have shaped the habitat conditions that these animals inhabited, and the animals would in turn have shaped the landscape in ways that the human managers would have had to accommodate. This is a complex ecological relationship, a co-evolutionary partnership between a sophisticated human management culture and the biota of an island that was being actively managed. And in some of the surviving fauna, particularly in the behavior patterns and habitat preferences of certain marsupial species, there are hints of that ancient relationship. Behaviors that make more sense in the context of a managed landscape than in the context of the unmanaged wilderness that Tasmania has been since the collapse of the management system. These hints are subtle, and their interpretation is speculative. But they add another layer to the picture, another indicator that the Tasmania we know is not the Tasmania that existed for most of the period of human habitation on the island. That we are looking at a landscape whose current ecological state is the product of 12,000 years of recovery from a management regime that shaped it profoundly during the period of greatest human activity. The forest we see is not primeval in the sense of being unchanged from before human presence. It is a forest that has been shaped by fire management, and that has recovered from the end of that management, and that has been left to its own devices for long enough to develop an appearance of wildness that conceals its managed history. The wilderness of Tasmania is a kind of archaeological artifact, the product of a particular historical process, beautiful, extraordinary, ecologically rich, but not what it was. And that raises one more question, perhaps the most practically important one for the present day. If the landscape of southwest Tasmania was managed for thousands of years by a sophisticated human culture, and if that management maintained particular ecological conditions that were in some ways more productive and more ecologically diverse than the conditions that prevail in the unmanaged forest today, then is there anything to be learned from understanding that management practice that might be relevant to the contemporary challenges of conservation and land management? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine scientific and practical question that a number of researchers are beginning to ask. Because the evidence from other regions where long-term indigenous land management practices have been studied and compared to the outcomes of European land management practices is increasingly clear. In a significant number of cases, the indigenous practices produced ecological outcomes that are, by multiple measures, more stable, more diverse, and more resilient than the outcomes of the European practices that replaced them. If the Tasmanian highland management system was producing comparable outcomes, if the burning and the drainage management and the other land management activities that the evidence suggests were occurring were generating a landscape that was more productive and more ecologically stable than what the post-collapse forest represents, then understanding what that system was doing and how it worked is not just of historical interest. It is of practical relevance to the people who are currently trying to manage a landscape that is under pressure from climate change, from invasive species, from altered fire regimes. This is one of the places where the past and the present connect in the Tasmania megastructure story, where the historical question and the contemporary question are the same question. What worked here? What was this land capable of supporting when it was managed by people who had spent tens of thousands of years learning how to manage it? And what might we learn, carefully and collaboratively with the descendants of those people, from trying to understand what they knew? These are the questions that make this story more than historical curiosity. They make it relevant. Urgently, practically relevant to the world that exists now and to the future that we are trying to navigate. The megastructures are one part of this story. The stones and the platforms and the drainage channels are the most dramatic evidence of what the pre-collapse Tasmanian civilization achieved. But they are not the most important thing about it. The most important thing is the knowledge, the accumulated ecological and astronomical and social knowledge that made those achievements possible. The knowledge that is now mostly lost. The knowledge that the surviving cultural traditions of the Aboriginal Tasmanian community may carry fragments of. The knowledge that the land itself, in its responses to different management practices, may be willing to teach again to those who are paying the right kind of attention. Recovering that knowledge is a project that will require decades. It will require collaboration between researchers and community members. It will require humility from the researchers and trust from the community, neither of which comes without effort and without history being honestly addressed. But it is a project that is beginning. And the beginning of a recovery project, however tentative and however far it is from completion, is a kind of hope. There is hope in Tasmania, even in the most difficult parts of this story, even in the parts about the catastrophe and the loss, because the stone is still there, and the people are still there, and the truth, however long it takes to fully recover, is still recoverable. That is where we leave the story for now. Not at an ending. There is no ending. The investigation continues. The debate continues. The collaboration continues. The landscape endures. The stones stand. Tasmania's lost megastructures are not truly lost. They have been waiting. And we are, at last, beginning to deserve what they are trying to tell us. If you have made it this far, then you are the kind of person who finds the real story of the world, in all its complexity and its difficulty and its astonishing richness, more interesting than any simplified version. You are the kind of person who sits with uncertainty without needing it to resolve too quickly, who can hold a question across the time it takes to begin to answer it. That is a rare and valuable quality, and this is exactly the kind of story that deserves that quality of attention. The island is there, the sea is there, the stones are there, the questions are open, and the investigation goes on. If you found yourself here, listening to this somewhere in the world, in whatever light or darkness is around you right now, know that you are part of a long chain of people who have looked at the human past and wanted to understand it more fully, who have refused to accept the simplified version, who have felt the pull of the real story beneath the official one. That pull is trustworthy. Follow it. The truth is more interesting than the story we were told. Rest well. The plateau is quiet tonight. The stones are standing in the dark. And somewhere under the peat and the forest and the cold southern sea, the evidence of a civilization we cannot name continues to wait, patiently, for the questions we have not yet known to ask. We will ask them. We are asking them now, and the answers, when they come, will change how we understand not just Tasmania, but ourselves. Good night, rest well, and thank you for listening. There is something that happens when you stay with a place long enough, when you stop passing through and start paying attention, When the details that seemed random begin to arrange themselves into patterns that you could not have seen if you had been moving too fast. This is what has happened with Tasmania, in the work of the people who have devoted years and sometimes decades to understanding it. And what they have found in that slow and patient attention goes even deeper than the structures. It goes into the water, not just the Bass Strait, not just the rivers and the lakes that make the Tasmanian interior one of the most extraordinary freshwater landscapes in the southern hemisphere, but into the water that falls from the sky and the water that rises from the ground and the water that moves through the landscape in patterns that, when you look at them carefully, are not entirely natural. The hydrology of the Tasmanian southwest is anomalous. Hydrologists who have studied the drainage patterns of the region using high-resolution terrain data have identified features that do not conform to the expected behavior of water in the landscape. Not dramatically, not in ways that shout for attention, but consistently, across multiple subcatchments and across a range of terrain types, the water moves in ways that imply a history of modification, channels that deviate from the gradient paths that water would naturally take. Divisions and diversions that preserve, at a landscape scale, the ghost of an ancient water management system. Water management. Another capability that the standard model of late Pleistocene Tasmania does not account for, because the management of water, the deliberate direction and control of its flow through the landscape, is one of the defining characteristics of agricultural civilization. Irrigation, flood control, the creation of stable water supplies for crops and livestock. These are the things that allowed the first civilizations in the Middle East and in China and in South Asia to grow large and complex. And they require knowledge, not just of water itself, but of terrain, of gradient, of the behavior of flowing water under different conditions. They require tools, and they require organization. The labor to build the channels and maintain them, the authority to direct that labor, the planning horizon to invest in infrastructure that will not pay off in the immediate term, but will benefit the community for generations. The Tasmanian southwest, by the account of its hydrology, was a managed water landscape, a landscape in which the people who inhabited it had learned to direct water where they wanted it, to sustain the productivity of the land that fed them. And that learning, encoded in the landscape in patterns that hydrological analysis is now beginning to read, is another dimension of the civilization that the standard history does not include. Why water? Why in this particular landscape? The answer lies in the ecology of the region. The Tasmanian southwest has a combination of very high rainfall, with annual totals in some areas exceeding 3 meters, and a landscape dominated by organic soils that are highly susceptible to waterlogging. Under natural conditions, large areas of the southwest are permanently or seasonally waterlogged, covered with button grass and sedge, and the characteristic bog vegetation of a landscape where drainage is poor and the water table is near the surface for much of the year. For a population dependent on plant food production, waterlogged bog is not ideal terrain. It supports the species that are adapted to it, some of which have food value, but it does not support the range and quantity of productive food plants that drained, aerated, mineral soil can sustain. To convert bog to productive agricultural land, you drain it. You dig channels, you lower the water table, you create conditions in which a wider range of food plants can grow and produce. The drainage system on the Central Plateau is not an isolated feature. It is one component, the most visible and best preserved because of the plateau's geological stability, of what appears to have been a much more extensive drainage management system across the southwest of the island. A system that, at its greatest extent, may have converted tens of thousands of hectares of bog and wetland into productive agricultural landscape. Tens of thousands of hectares. At a time when the total land area of the Greater Tasmanian region, including the Bass Strait lowlands, was considerably larger than the island's current extent. In a landscape where rainfall was high and reliable, and the soils, once drained, were potentially very productive. In a climate that, during the Ice Age maximum, was colder and drier than today, but that, during the subsequent warming period, was becoming progressively warmer and wetter in ways that may have actually favored agricultural expansion for a time before the sea rise overtook the benefits. The picture that emerges, the more you look, is of a civilization in its prime. A civilization that was managing the landscape intensively, that was expanding its agricultural capacity as the climate warmed, that was growing in population and organizational complexity, and that was, in the period just before the sea rise accelerated, at something close to its maximum development. And then the sea came in. Not quickly enough to be experienced as a single catastrophe by any individual, but quickly enough, over the span of a few generations, to be experienced as a catastrophic loss of territory. The Bass Strait lowlands, the most productive and most densely inhabited parts of the civilization's territory, were gradually, relentlessly inundated. The populations that had lived in those lowlands were displaced upward into the highland margins. The agricultural systems in the lowlands were drowned. The trade routes and communication networks that had connected the different parts of the civilization were disrupted by the advancing sea. And the highland landscape, into which the displaced lowland populations were retreating, was not adequate to support the numbers and the organizational complexity that the civilization had achieved in the lowlands. The highlands were cold. The soils were thinner. The drainage management system that had been developed there was an extension of the lowland system, supporting a population that was part of a larger whole. When the lowland whole was destroyed, the highland part could not sustain itself at the same level. The organizational complexity that required the full economic output of the combined lowland and highland territory could not be maintained on the output of the highlands alone. The collapse was not sudden. Collapses rarely are. It was a gradual decline, probably extending over several generations, during which the maintenance of the infrastructure became progressively less reliable as the labor pool shrank and the organizational capacity to direct collective work diminished. The drainage channels silted up. The platforms were no longer maintained. The standing stones continued to stand, because they required no maintenance. But the ceremonies and the practical activities associated with them were no longer conducted with their previous regularity. The burning patterns became more localized. The population contracted and fragmented into smaller groups that were increasingly mobile rather than sedentary. The forest moved in. The bog returned to areas that had been drained. And slowly, over centuries, the landscape erased the more perishable traces of what had been here, leaving only the stones, the buried channels, the ghost patterns in the hydrology, and the anomalous features that satellite surveys are now beginning to detect. The collapse was real. The loss was real. And the people who survived it and their descendants over the subsequent 10,000 years were doing something genuinely remarkable in just maintaining their identity and their relationship to the country through conditions that would have challenged any human group. Let us talk about those 10,000 years, the long post-collapse period, the period that the standard history of Tasmania actually knows something about, however imperfectly. The period of the small bands, the mobile foragers, the people who managed to sustain life in one of the most challenging environments in the southern hemisphere without the agricultural infrastructure that their ancestors had built. This period is undervalued. It is routinely described in terms of absence of the things that the Aboriginal Tasmanians of the historical period did not have, rather than in terms of the things they did have. And what they had was extraordinary. They had ecological knowledge of depth and precision that is almost impossible to fully appreciate from the outside. The knowledge of how to live in the Tasmanian environment without destroying it, how to find food and maintain health and navigate the landscape in conditions that Europeans who came with guns and metal tools and preserved food still found profoundly challenging. This knowledge was not simple. It was the accumulated product of 10,000 years of careful, attentive interaction with an environment that was constantly changing in response to the climate shifts of the post-glacial period. It was knowledge of dozens of ecosystems, of hundreds of species, of seasonal patterns and weather signs and animal behavior. Knowledge that would fill many volumes if it could be fully recovered. They had social organization, not the large-scale organizational complexity of the pre-collapse civilization, but the sophisticated, adaptive social organization of small groups that cooperate across kin networks to manage risk and share resources in ways that make survival possible in conditions where any individual or isolated nuclear family would quickly perish. The management of relationships, the maintenance of reciprocity networks, the regulation of conflict, the transmission of knowledge, All of these things require social sophistication, and they were present in the Aboriginal Tasmanian communities in forms that the ethnographic record, fragmentary as it is, makes clear. They had ceremony, they had art. The rock engravings that they made on surfaces across the island are not simple marks. They are expressions of a cosmological understanding, a set of beliefs about the nature of the world and human beings' place in it, that is sophisticated and coherent and connected to the landscape in specific ways. The engravings are in particular places for reasons. They reference particular features of the landscape and the sky. They are part of a system of understanding that was, even in its reduced post-collapse form, complex and internally coherent. And they had, as the recent genetic evidence is beginning to suggest, a degree of genetic diversity that implies that the post-collapse population was not quite as isolated as the standard model has assumed. There are hints in the genetic data of connections that should not be there according to the isolation model. Hints that suggest either the population was larger and more internally diverse than previously thought, or that there was some limited but real contact with other populations even during the island's period of separation from the mainland. The mechanics of how such contact might have occurred are not clear, but the seafaring capability of the Aboriginal Tasmanians, at least within the island's own waters, is documented. They built and used watercraft of various types. They crossed significant stretches of open water to reach offshore islands. And there are islands, stepping stones of various sizes, scattered between Tasmania and the mainland that would have made island-hopping contact possible, if not easy, even after the main land bridge was gone. The degree to which this possibility was actually realized, the degree to which the post-collapse Tasmanian population maintained any real contact with the wider world, is one of the open questions in Tasmanian prehistory. The genetic hints suggest it was not zero. The standard isolation model may be too absolute, but how much contact there was, and when, and what it involved, are questions for future research. Let us talk about the engraving tradition in more detail, because it is both a window into the cosmological understanding of the people and a link to the pre-collapse period that is worth examining. The geometric motifs that appear in Tasmanian rock engravings are, as noted, formally comparable to motifs found in engraving traditions at considerable geographic distances. But there is more to this than formal similarity. There is also a striking consistency of context. The Tasmanian engravings tend to appear in locations that have specific landscape characteristics, near water, at terrain transitions, at points in the landscape where significant views are available, in sites that, when their positions are mapped in relation to the astronomical horizon events that the standing stone alignments reference, show systematic spatial relationships to those events. This suggests that the engraving tradition and the stone construction tradition are not independent cultural expressions, but components of a single integrated cultural system. A system in which the marking of the landscape with geometric imagery, the construction of astronomical alignment features, and the management of the physical environment through burning and drainage were all aspects of a coherent relationship to the country that combined the practical and the ceremonial in ways that the Western distinction between the two cannot adequately capture. This integrated approach to the landscape, the understanding of land management and ceremonial activity and astronomical observation as aspects of a single practice, is something that is documented in living indigenous cultures in various parts of the world. The relationship between ecological knowledge and ceremonial knowledge in many Aboriginal Australian traditions, where the ceremonies are also knowledge systems encoding practical information about the landscape and its management, is a well-documented example. And it is an example that provides a framework for understanding what the Tasmanian evidence might represent. If the pre-collapse Tasmanian civilization had this kind of integrated relationship to its landscape, then the structures it built were not purely engineering and not purely ceremony. They were both simultaneously. The platforms served as observation points and as ceremonial sites. The standing stones served as calendrical instruments and as markers of significant places in the ceremonial geography of the landscape. The drainage channels served to produce food and to fulfill the obligations of stewardship that the culture understood as incumbent on those who managed the country. This integration is the thing that is hardest to recover from the physical evidence alone, because the physical evidence only shows the practical dimension of the structures. The ceremonial dimension, the meanings encoded in their placement and their form, the practices associated with their use, these things left no physical trace except in the engravings and in the oral traditions, and of both of these we have only fragments. But the fragments point toward an integration that is consistent with what we know from comparable cultures, and that consistency is itself a kind of evidence. It tells us that whatever the specific content of the Tasmanian ceremonial system was, it is likely to have been of the same general type as ceremonial systems that are better documented elsewhere. Systems in which the practical and the sacred are unified rather than separated. Systems in which land management is understood as a moral and spiritual obligation rather than a purely economic activity. Systems in which the observation of the sky is part of the same practice as the management of the earth. This is, in some ways, the most important thing that the Tasmanian evidence has to tell us. Not just that a sophisticated civilization existed here, though it did, but that the sophistication of that civilization was of a particular kind, a kind that we are only beginning to recognize and appreciate, partly because it does not fit the Western categories of civilization, religion, science, and technology as separate domains. A kind that integrated knowledge and practice and meaning in ways that produced extraordinary results, and that, despite being largely destroyed, left enough traces in the physical record and in the surviving culture for us to begin to understand what was there. That understanding is worth pursuing, not just for its historical value, but for what it might teach us about ways of relating to a landscape that are more sustainable, more integrative, and more durable than the ways that have characterized the dominant global culture for the last several centuries. The Tasmanian civilization managed its landscape for tens of thousands of years. The European management of the same landscape began 3 centuries ago and is already showing signs of unsustainability. The comparison is stark, and it points toward a question that is becoming urgent in the context of climate change and ecological degradation. What did they know that we do not? And how do we find out? Let us spend some time with the people who are doing the work of finding out. The researchers who are most deeply engaged with the Tasmanian evidence come from a range of disciplines. Archaeologists, geologists, hydrologists, ecologists, astronomers, anthropologists, geneticists, and, increasingly, Aboriginal Tasmanian community members who are taking an active role in the investigation and interpretation of evidence relating to their own heritage. This last development is significant. The history of the relationship between academic research institutions and Indigenous Australian communities over the archaeological and anthropological record has not always been a good one. Research has been conducted without community consent. Results have been published in ways that ignored or contradicted community knowledge. Collections of human remains and cultural objects have been held in institutions overseas without the consent of the communities they were taken from. The legacy of this history has created, understandably, a degree of wariness in Aboriginal communities about new research initiatives that claim to be investigating their heritage. The more recent collaborations that have characterized the best of the current Tasmanian research are different in approach. They begin with community engagement and consent. They treat community knowledge as a form of evidence rather than as cultural background to be noted and set aside. They share findings with communities as they develop rather than presenting conclusions as fate's accomplice. And they recognize that the authority to determine what is known about this heritage and what is made public does not rest exclusively with the researchers. This approach takes longer. It produces fewer dramatic publications. It sometimes means sitting with uncertainty for longer than researchers would prefer, because the community is not ready to have certain questions answered or certain evidence disclosed. But it produces better research, more honest research. Research that is more likely to be accurate because it incorporates more sources of knowledge and more perspectives on what the evidence means. And it produces something else. Something that is harder to quantify but no less real. A relationship. A trust, however tentative, between the research institutions and the communities whose heritage the research addresses. A recognition that the knowledge being recovered belongs, ultimately, to those communities, and that the researchers are participants in a process of recovery that serves the community's interests, not just the interests of academic knowledge production. This is how it should work. And the fact that in Tasmania, with its particularly painful history of colonial destruction, it is beginning to work this way is one of the more hopeful signs in a story that has had many dark chapters. Let us talk about what future investigation might reveal, what questions remain open, what discoveries might be made in the coming decades if the research continues with adequate funding and adequate collaboration. The most obvious direction is the seafloor. The Bass Strait remains largely unsurveyed at the resolution that would be required to detect the remains of built structures. The technology exists, the research vessels and the sonar equipment and the remotely operated vehicles that would be needed for a systematic survey are available. What is missing is the funding, the political will to commit it, and the framework for managing what such a survey might find. A systematic seafloor survey of the Bass Strait, conducted at the resolution that modern sonar technology allows, would be a major undertaking. It would cover an area of approximately 60,000 square kilometers at depths ranging from a few meters to several hundred meters. It would produce an enormous volume of data requiring significant processing and interpretation capacity. And it would, almost certainly, produce results that are currently difficult to anticipate. The analog from other parts of the world where comparable surveys have been conducted, in the North Sea, in the Gulf of Cambat, in parts of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, is that the results are always surprising. The submerged ancient landscapes that have been discovered in these areas have consistently been more complex, more extensively modified, and more evidently inhabited than the survey's planners expected. There is no reason to expect the Bass Strait to be different. What the survey would find if the analog holds is a landscape that was heavily settled and intensively managed during the period of its exposure. River systems carrying traffic and providing water for agriculture, coastal settlements at the mouths of those rivers, and possibly built structures. The remains of what the pre-collapse civilization built in the lowlands, now lying on the seafloor under the sediment that has accumulated since the sea rose. Some of those structures might be too degraded to detect even with the best sonar. 12,000 years of marine sediment deposition, of biological activity, of current scour and storm disturbance would have done significant damage to organic and fragile inorganic materials. But stone structures, particularly if buried by sediment quickly, might have survived in states that are at least detectable by sub-bottom profiling. The cross-sections of buried walls, the anomalous density patterns of cut stone versus natural bedrock, these things show up in sonar data. They have shown up in other places. They might show up in the Bass Strait. This survey needs to happen. It is one of the most important potential archaeological investigations in the world right now, and it has not happened primarily because the political and institutional will to conduct it has not been assembled. The question of who funds it, who conducts it, who has authority over what is found, and how findings are shared with and managed by the Aboriginal Tasmanian community are all questions that need to be answered before the survey can begin. But they can be answered. They have been answered in analogous situations elsewhere, and the potential value of the knowledge that could be recovered is extraordinary. Beyond the seafloor, there is the question of more intensive investigation of the highland sites. The platforms and enclosures and standing stone alignments that have been identified need to be dated more precisely, mapped in more detail, and analyzed with a fuller suite of methods than has been possible with the resources so far available. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the larger features would provide information about their internal structure that is currently only guessed at from surface observation. Systematic excavation of carefully chosen test locations, conducted in collaboration with the Aboriginal Tasmanian community, would provide datable material and would reveal construction details that cannot be inferred from surface survey. And there is the question of genetics, the genetic history of the Aboriginal Tasmanian population, and of the broader Aboriginal, Australian, and Pacific populations with which it has potential connections, is becoming increasingly legible as sequencing technology improves and as more individuals contribute their genetic data to research projects. The pattern of genetic diversity in the Aboriginal Tasmanian community and the specific markers that indicate population history and contact has the potential to provide direct evidence about questions like the size of the pre-collapse population, the timing of the collapse, the nature of any post-collapse contact with other populations, and the degree of genetic diversity that the historical population represented. This research, too, is sensitive. Genetic research involving indigenous communities raises significant ethical and political questions about consent, data ownership, and the potential for misuse of findings. These questions need to be addressed carefully and with genuine respect for community authority over decisions about what research is conducted and how findings are shared. But the questions can be addressed, and the knowledge that properly conducted genetic research could provide is genuinely significant. The investigation is at an early stage. The evidence is accumulating. The frameworks are evolving. And the picture that is emerging of a complex, sophisticated, and deeply rooted civilization in the greater Tasmanian region is becoming steadily clearer and more detailed. What it will look like in another 50 years of research, with better tools, better collaboration, and a better intellectual framework for understanding what human beings were capable of in the deep past, is genuinely unpredictable. But it will almost certainly be more complex, more impressive, and more fully deserving of the word civilization than anything that the standard model of Tasmanian prehistory has yet acknowledged. The stones are still standing. The plateau is still there. The seafloor still holds what the sea covered 12,000 years ago. And the descendants of the people who built what we are only beginning to understand are still here, still connected to this country, still waiting for the world to understand what happened here and what it means. Let us not make them wait much longer. There is a dimension to this story that has not yet been addressed, and it is perhaps the most personal dimension of all. The question of what it means for the people alive today in Tasmania to carry this history. To be the descendants of a civilization that built megastructures and managed a landscape the size of a small country and watched the stars from precisely oriented stone alignments, and to have lived for most of the past 2 centuries in a world that described your ancestors as primitive and your culture as evidence of the most rudimentary stage of human development. That experience is specific to the Aboriginal Tasmanian community. It is their experience, not mine to describe in detail or to appropriate for narrative purposes. But the fact of it is relevant to the story, because the story of the megastructures does not end with the last stone placed, or the last field drained, or the sea finally closing over the Bass Strait lowlands. It continues into the present, in the lives of the people who are descended from the builders, and in the relationship between those people and the land that their ancestors made. That relationship has been under pressure for 300 years. It was nearly destroyed. The physical and cultural violence of the colonial period nearly succeeded in ending it entirely. That it survived, that there are Aboriginal Tasmanian people today who identify with their heritage and who are working to understand and protect it, is a consequence of individual and collective courage and resilience that deserves to be named. The megastructure story is, in the end, their story. Not the story of researchers who discover it and write about it, their story. The story of their ancestors and their land and the catastrophic events that shaped both. The story of what was built and what was lost and what endured, and the recovery of that story through archaeological investigation and through the revitalization of cultural knowledge and through the establishment of legal and political recognition of their rights over their heritage is a project that belongs to them. The role of outside researchers and of the broader public that finds this story interesting and significant is supportive, to provide resources, to extend recognition, to share the platform, to listen, carefully and without appropriating, to what the community says about its own history and its own relationship to the evidence. That is a humble role, but it is the right one. And it is, ultimately, the only role that leads to a genuinely true account of what happened here. Because no account of Tasmanian prehistory that is produced without the active participation and authority of the Aboriginal Tasmanian community can be fully trusted. The community holds knowledge that no external researcher has access to. Knowledge about the land, knowledge about the ceremonies, knowledge about the stories. Knowledge that has been kept through everything, for exactly this moment. The moment when the wider world is finally ready to hear what happened here. Are we ready? That is the real question that the Tasmania megastructure story puts to us. Are we ready to hear a version of human prehistory that is more complex, more sophisticated, and more morally demanding than the one we were taught? Are we ready to acknowledge that the frameworks we have used to understand the past were incomplete in specific ways that served specific interests? Are we ready to revise our understanding not just of the technical record, but of the human record, of who was capable of what, in ways that have implications for how we understand the present? These are not comfortable questions. They have not always been comfortable to ask in the institutions where the evidence is studied and interpreted, but they are the right questions. And the Tasmanian evidence, in its quiet persistence, its refusal to be explained away, its accumulation across multiple independent lines of investigation pointing in the same direction, is asking them. The stones are asking them. The seafloor anomalies are asking them. The sediment cores with their charcoal layers are asking them. The drainage channels that direct water in patterns that no natural process can produce are asking them. And the people of the Aboriginal Tasmanian community, who have known all along that their ancestors were more than the colonial narrative allowed, are asking them. We should answer. The answer begins with listening, with looking at the evidence honestly and without preconception, with following the data wherever it goes, even when it goes to places that require revising the frameworks that have made careers and filled textbooks and organized the way that entire academic disciplines understand their subject matter. The answer continues with collaboration, with building the relationships and the trust and the shared frameworks of understanding that make genuine collaborative research possible, with treating the knowledge that the Aboriginal Tasmanian community holds as a form of evidence, not as background material or human interest story. And the answer culminates in recognition. In the public acknowledgement by the institutions and the governments and the societies that have the authority to make such acknowledgements meaningful, that what happened in the Greater Tasmanian region over the last 30,000 years is a story of civilization. A real civilization. A sophisticated, complex, ecologically intelligent civilization that managed one of the most challenging environments on Earth with extraordinary skill and knowledge over an extraordinary span of time. That was destroyed, first by an environmental catastrophe and then by a human one. And that deserves to be understood and recognized as fully as any civilization that left its monuments above water for the cameras and the tourists. That recognition is not yet fully given. It is coming. The evidence is making it inevitable. But the speed at which it comes and the fullness with which it is given are matters of choice, of will, of the decision to look clearly at what the evidence says and to respond to it with honesty. The lake country of the Tasmanian Central Plateau is quiet at night. The lakes reflect the stars, those same stars that the people on the plateau were watching 12,000 years ago and 15,000 years ago and further back than we currently know how to measure. The Pandani stand in their dark shapes against the night sky. The occasional call of a night bird crosses the silence, and the stones stand where they were placed, marking a sunrise that no one now watches, in a geometry whose meaning is only beginning to be recovered. The world does not hurry. The stones have waited 12,000 years. They can wait a little longer. But we should not take too much longer. The evidence is there. The people are there. The tools are there. The only thing needed is the will to do the work and the honesty to accept what the work reveals. Let that be the takeaway from this long journey through the evidence of what happened in Tasmania. Not wonder at the mystery, though wonder is appropriate. Not satisfaction at the solution, because the solution is far from complete. But commitment, the commitment to taking the evidence seriously, to building the collaborations that can extend the investigation, to listening to the people who have been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. The megastructures are lost only in the sense that they have been waiting to be found. They are being found. And everything they have to tell us is worth hearing. Everything. The plateau waits. The sea covers its secrets. The stones stand in the dark. And somewhere in the intersection of the physical evidence and the cultural knowledge and the patient work of researchers and communities finding ways to understand it together, the shape of what really happened here is becoming visible. Not yet fully visible, not yet fully understood, but visible enough to see that it is something extraordinary, something that should change how we think about this place and these people and the deep human story that connects us all. The investigation continues, the collaboration deepens, the evidence accumulates, and the truth, whatever its final form, is worth everything it costs to find it. Rest here. Let the plateau be quiet around you. Let the distance between now and then collapse for a moment, across the 10,000 years and the 12,000 years, and the further reaches that the evidence is beginning to suggest. Let the people who built these things be present for a moment, not as abstract historical figures, not as the subjects of an academic investigation, but as people, as human beings who woke up in the morning with things to do, who managed the land they lived in with knowledge and care and a sense of obligation that expressed itself in everything they built, who watched the stars at night with the same wonder and the same practical attention that drives human beings everywhere to look up and ask what it all means. They were here. They built these things. They loved this land. And the land remembers them in the stones and the channels and the ghost patterns in the hydrology and the particular ways that the ancient drainage has left its mark in the distribution of the vegetation that the satellites can see from space. The land remembers, and we are beginning to remember with it. Good night, Tasmania. Good night to everyone listening from wherever you are in the world, in whatever darkness or light surrounds you right now. The story of this island is a story about all of us, about what we are capable of, about what we can lose, about what endures, and about what, with enough care and enough honesty and enough willingness to look clearly at what the evidence actually says, we can still find. Sleep well, the stones are standing, the plateau is quiet, and somewhere in the cold, clear water of a highland lake, the stars that the ancient watchers tracked are still reflected, moving slowly across the surface, as they have been every night for 10,000 years and more. They will be there when you wake up, the work will be there when you wake up, and the truth, unhurried and patient and extraordinary, will still be waiting to be fully understood. That is not a bad thing to sleep on. Good night. There is one more thing that deserves to be said about the stones. Not the what of them, not the how, not the when, but the fact of their endurance itself. Because there is something philosophically significant about the endurance of a stone placed by a human hand 12,000 years ago. Something that says something about the relationship between the makers and the made, between the people who shape the world and the world that outlasts them. Every stone placed in those highland alignments was touched by a human hand. Selected, moved, positioned. Somebody stood where that stone now stands and placed it with intention. That act, the act of placing, was momentary. It happened once, in a moment that is now 12,000 years in the past. But the result of that act is still there. The stone is still where it was placed. The intention embedded in the placement is still readable, to those who know how to read it, in the geometry of the arrangement. This is what it means to build. To reach forward in time, to invest labor and skill and knowledge in an artifact that will outlast the moment of its creation by a span of time the creator cannot fully imagine. The person who placed that stone did not know that 12,000 years later, researchers with satellite dishes and ground-penetrating radar would be looking at it and trying to understand what it meant. They could not have known that. The timescale is beyond human intuition. But they knew, or perhaps simply assumed, without thinking about it much, that the stone would be there when they came back, that it would still mark the sunrise next year and the year after. That the knowledge encoded in its placement would still be accessible to the people who needed it. And they were right. In a way that exceeds what they imagined, the stone is still there. It still marks the sunrise. The knowledge encoded in its placement is still, slowly, being recovered. There is something in this that is genuinely moving if you let yourself feel it. Not sentimental, not mystical, just the plain fact of a human act persisting across 12,000 years and still being legible. Still being capable of conveying something about the people who did it. The legibility is partial. We cannot read the full meaning of the placement. We can measure the orientation. We can identify the astronomical event it references. We can note the care with which the stone was selected and positioned, but the full context of meaning, the ceremonies that were conducted here, the stories that explained why this sunrise mattered, the songs that were sung when the light fell in the right place at the right moment, these things are gone. The stone is a fragment of a message, whose full text we no longer have. But a fragment of a message is not the same as no message. A fragment still communicates something. It still carries information. And the work of recovering as much of the message as is still recoverable is work that is worth doing. The stone is doing its part. It is still there. It is still oriented. It is still waiting for the sun to rise where it was placed to mark. The question is whether we are doing our part, whether we are paying the attention that the stone is asking for, whether we are bringing to the encounter with this evidence the full seriousness and care and commitment to truth that it deserves. That is the challenge that the Tasmanian megastructures pose. Not the challenge of mystery, of wondering what strange forces could have produced such anomalous evidence, but the challenge of responsibility, the responsibility to take the evidence seriously, to follow it where it leads, to build the collaborations and the frameworks that can extract its full significance, and to share what is learned in ways that serve the interests of the communities whose heritage it represents. This is the challenge of all serious inquiry into human prehistory. It is sharpened, in the Tasmanian case, by the particular history of colonial destruction that makes the stakes of getting the story right higher than usual. The story of what happened here is not just an academic question. It has implications for how the Aboriginal Tasmanian community understands and presents its own heritage, for how the broader Australian society understands its relationship to the oldest living cultures on Earth, for how the world understands the range and sophistication of human capability in the deep past. Getting the story right matters. And getting it right requires exactly the kind of patient, evidence-based, collaborative, humble, persistent inquiry that the best of the current Tasmanian research represents. The story is being gotten right. Slowly. Imperfectly. With the inevitable errors and revisions that characterize all genuine inquiry into difficult questions. But it is moving in the right direction, toward a fuller, more honest, more complex, and more accurate understanding of what happened in this extraordinary place over the last 30,000 years. Let us hold that thought as we move toward the end of this particular journey through the evidence. The island is there, the evidence is there, the people are there, the work is ongoing, and the truth, piece by piece, is being recovered. That is the story of Tasmania's lost megastructures. Not a story about mystery for its own sake. Not a story about hidden knowledge that challenges mainstream science for the thrill of the challenge, but a story about human achievement, about the extraordinary things that human beings are capable of, about the catastrophes that can destroy those achievements and the ways in which the traces of them endure, about the long, difficult, necessary work of recovering the truth about our own past, and about the communities of people who carry that past in their bodies and their ceremonies and their relationships to the land, and who have been waiting for the world to understand what they have always known. The stones are their ancestors' work, the land is their country, the story is their story. And we are fortunate to be living in a time when it is being told more fully and more honestly than ever before to anyone who will listen. If you are still here, still listening, in whatever darkness or light surrounds you, you are part of that telling. You are part of the circle of attention that makes recovery possible. Every mind that engages with this evidence, that takes it seriously, that follows its implications honestly, adds something to the collective capacity to understand what happened here. The investigation needs all the attention it can get, the funding, the collaboration, the public engagement that makes it possible to advocate for the resources that serious research requires, and the simple human willingness to sit with a difficult, complex, unresolved story and let it matter. This story matters, this island matters, these people matter, these stones matter. They have been waiting 12,000 years for us to understand that. Let us not make them wait much longer. The sun will rise tomorrow over the plateau. It will rise where the stones mark it to rise, give or take the slow drift of astronomical positions that the builders could not account for, but that researchers can now calculate to within minutes of arc. It will fall on the ancient ground and the recent grass and the weathered stone faces, and for a moment, the connection will be made between the act of placement and the act of observation across the long silence of the years. Nobody who knew the full meaning of that connection will be there to see it. But the connection will be made, and we will be one day closer to understanding what it meant to the people who made it. That is enough. For now, that is enough. Good night from the bottom of the world. Good night from the island that the sea shaped and the ice carved and the people managed and the centuries covered and the satellites are slowly beginning to reveal. Good night from the place where the megastructures stand in their quiet persistence, waiting for the questions we are only now learning to ask. The morning will come, the sun will rise in the place it was marked to rise, and the work will continue. Sleep well. There is a particular quality of silence that the Tasmanian wilderness produces that you do not find in many other places in the world. It is not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street. It is the silence of an enormously full world from which the human voice has been absent for a very long time. A silence that has texture and depth, that pushes back against the presence of the person who enters it. That says, in the way that landscapes say things, that something happened here once and then stopped. And the stopping has been so long and so complete that the silence has grown over it like moss over stone. That silence is what surrounds the megastructure sites on the central plateau. If you stood in the middle of one of those enclosures on a still, clear morning, with the button grass still around you and the sky an impossible shade of southern blue above, and listened, what you would hear would be the silence of a place that has not held organized human activity for 12,000 years, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of aftermath. It is a distinctive thing. And it is one of the reasons that the researchers who spend significant time in these places often describe an experience that goes beyond the purely intellectual. An encounter with scale, with time, with the magnitude of what has been lost and what has been preserved. An encounter that changes, subtly but permanently, how you understand the relationship between human beings and the earth they live on. Because the silence of the Tasmanian megastructure sites is not just the silence of one civilization's absence, it is the silence of a possibility that existed and then ceased to exist. A possibility for a different kind of human relationship to this landscape than the one that replaced it. A possibility that was working, by every available measure, for a very long time before it ended. And that ended not because of any internal failure, not because the people abandoned it or grew beyond it or chose a different path. It ended because the world changed under their feet, in a way and at a pace that no human organization, however sophisticated, could have withstood. The end was not a choice. It was a catastrophe. And the silence that fills those enclosures now is the silence of something that ended because of a catastrophe, not because it had run its course. There is something in that silence that feels incomplete, something that suggests unfinished business. Not in a supernatural sense, in a very practical sense. The work that those people were doing was the work of sustaining life in a particular place, in a particular way. And the place is still there. And the life that needs sustaining is still there, both in the ecological sense and in the cultural sense of the Aboriginal Tasmanian community that carries the connection to this place forward through time. The unfinished business is the recovery, not the recovery of the civilization itself, which has gone beyond any possibility of literal reconstruction, but the recovery of the knowledge that the civilization embodied, the knowledge of how this landscape works, what it can sustain, how it responds to different kinds of management. What the optimal relationship between human activity and the ecology of the southwest Tasmanian wilderness actually is. That knowledge is not entirely lost. It is fragmented. It is distributed across the physical traces in the landscape, across the fragments of oral tradition that survived the colonial period, across the accumulated observations of ecologists and botanists and hydrologists who have studied the landscape without necessarily recognizing the full history of human management that shaped it. And it is present in forms that are not always accessible to outside researchers, in the cultural knowledge of the Aboriginal Tasmanian community. Knowledge of the country. Knowledge of the relationships between different elements of the landscape. Knowledge that has been maintained, however attenuated, across the millennia since the collapse, because it is the kind of knowledge that a people's relationship to their country depends on, and that a people with that kind of relationship to their country finds ways to keep. The recovery of this knowledge is not a simple task. It is not the kind of thing that can be accomplished by a research team with a grant and a 3-year timeline. It is a generational project. A project that requires sustained commitment from institutions and from communities and from the broader society that has an interest in understanding this place and its history. But it is possible. It has begun. And the beginning of a necessary project is a significant thing, even when the project itself is vast and the beginning is small. The research continues. The collaboration continues. The stones stand. And the silence of the plateau, the silence of 12,000 years of aftermath, is no longer entirely the silence of a past that has been forgotten. It is becoming, slowly, the silence of a past that is being remembered. That is a different kind of silence, fuller, less absolute, inhabited, in a sense, by the attention that is being paid to it, by the questions being asked within it, by the presence of the researchers and the community members who are working together to understand what happened here and what it means. The stones stand in that silence, the plateau stretches under the southern sky, and the investigation continues, as it must, as it will, for as long as there are people willing to ask the right questions and look honestly at what the answers reveal. Let us now draw together what has been covered in this long journey through the evidence, the landscape, the people, and the questions that remain. Tasmania is an island at the southern edge of the world whose standard history describes it as a simple place with a simple prehistoric culture. The evidence from satellite remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, sediment analysis, hydrological study, cave investigation, and seafloor sonar suggests something far more complex. A civilization of significant organizational sophistication existed in the Greater Tasmanian region during the late Pleistocene, managing the landscape on a large scale, constructing substantial structures with astronomical significance, developing water management systems that converted bog to agricultural land, and sustaining itself across a territory considerably larger than the current island. This civilization was destroyed, not by internal failure or external conquest, but by the post-glacial rise of the sea that flooded the Bass Strait lowlands where most of its population lived and most of its agricultural infrastructure was located. The population that survived in the highland remnant underwent a collapse of organizational complexity, reverting over several generations to the mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle that European observers documented in the 18th century. The descendants of this civilization's survivors are the Aboriginal Tasmanian community. They carry, in their cultural traditions and their relationship to the country, fragments of an inheritance that is far older and far more complex than the colonial narrative acknowledged. The recovery of that inheritance, through physical investigation, through cultural revitalization, and through genuine collaboration between researchers and communities, is one of the most important intellectual and moral projects currently underway in Australia. The megastructures of Tasmania are not mysteries in the sense of unexplained anomalies requiring exotic explanations. They are the physical traces of a sophisticated human civilization that the standard model of prehistory failed to anticipate because the evidence for it was largely hidden underwater and under the accumulated silence of 12,000 years. Their discovery, in the full sense of understanding what they are and what they mean, is ongoing. The investigation is incomplete. The story is not fully told. The questions that remain open are as significant as those that have been answered. And the engagement of the wider public with this evidence, the interest and the attention and the advocacy for the resources that will allow the investigation to continue, is part of what makes it possible to continue. This is why these stories matter. Not because they are sensational, though they are that, but because they are real. Because they are about real people who built real things in a real place for real reasons. Because the recovery of their story is an act of justice as much as an act of knowledge. And because the knowledge itself, when it is fully recovered, will change in significant ways how we understand what human beings are capable of and what we owe to the deep past that made us. The island is there. The evidence is there. The people are there. The stones are standing. And the truth is still being found. That is where we leave this story. Not at an ending, at a continuing, at the ongoing process of inquiry and recovery and recognition that is the only adequate response to what the evidence from Tasmania reveals. The sun will rise over the plateau tomorrow, the stones will mark it, and the work will continue. For everyone who has listened to this, who has followed this evidence through its twists and turns and complications and implications, who has sat with the discomfort of a story that challenges comfortable frameworks and demands more of the world than the world has yet delivered. Thank you. Your attention is part of the investigation. Your interest is part of what makes the recovery possible. The past is not past. It is present in the stones and the sediment and the surviving culture and the ongoing inquiry. And the future of our understanding of that past depends on the quality of the attention we bring to it. Bring the best attention you have. The stones deserve it. The people deserve it. The truth deserves it. And with that, we have come to the end of this particular journey. Not to the end of the story, never to the end of the story, but to the end of this part of it. Rest well. Dream of the plateau. Dream of the stones in the dark and the sun that rises where they mark it to rise. Dream of the sea that came in and the people who survived it and the long, slow, extraordinary persistence of the things they built and the knowledge they carried and the identity they maintained across 10,000 years of isolation and diminishing circumstances. They were here. They are here. And the world is slowly, finally, beginning to understand what that means. Good night from the bottom of the world. Good night from the island that the megastructures built and the sea partly buried and the silence preserved. Good night from a story that is not yet finished and that will not be finished until the full truth of what happened here is known. That day is coming. Sleep well until it arrives. There is a geologist named Marcus who has spent the better part of 20 years working in the Tasmanian southwest. He is not famous. He does not have a television show. His name does not appear in popular accounts of Australian prehistory. But among the small community of researchers who take the highland anomalies seriously, he is known as someone who pays extremely close attention to what the rocks are telling him. Marcus was not looking for megastructures when he first found what he found. He was mapping dolerite outcrops for a survey of potential resource areas, doing the kind of routine work that goes into the background data of dozens of government reports, the kind of data that gets filed and referenced and almost never read by anyone who did not produce it. What he found, in a valley that the standard geological maps showed as unremarkable, was a series of outcrops whose weathering patterns did not conform to what dolerite outcrops in this environment are supposed to look like. Dolerite weathers in predictable ways. The hexagonal columns that characterize fresh dolerite exposures break down along their joint planes in a sequence that geologists can read like a clock. This valley's outcrops had been weathering differently. In some places, the weathering sequence had been interrupted. Faces of fresh rock were exposed where weathered faces should have been. Angles of breakage that do not occur in natural weathering were present on multiple blocks. Marcus looked at this for a long time, and then he followed the interrupted weathering to its source, which was a series of blocks that had been moved. Not recently. The lichens on their surfaces were old, and the recolonization of their exposed faces was consistent with disturbance that occurred many thousands of years ago, but moved, selected, detached from the parent outcrop, and transported to new positions in a pattern that, once Marcus began mapping it, revealed itself as a structure, a low wall, running for approximately 80 meters across the valley floor, made of dolerite blocks selected for their size and shape and arranged in a sequence that was too regular to be the result of natural block accumulation. Not spectacular, not immediately impressive. You would walk past it without noticing if you were not looking for it. But once you were looking at it, once you understood what you were seeing, it was unmistakable. A wall. A very old wall, in a valley that the standard prehistory of Tasmania says had no significant human presence. Marcus filed his report. He noted the anomalous weathering patterns. He mapped the position and extent of the wall. He submitted radiocarbon dating requests for organic material from the sediment at the base of the wall structure. He waited. The dating results came back after several months. The organic material at the base of the wall dated to a period between 8 and 12,000 years before present, with the higher end of the range being the more geologically plausible given the sediment context. 8 to 12,000 years, post-sea rise period, within the range of what the standard model describes as the period of simple, mobile, small band occupation of the island. But walls are not part of that simple, mobile, small band story. Walls imply return. They imply that whoever built them expected to come back to the same place often enough to invest the labor of building a permanent feature there. They imply a relationship to this particular valley that was not the relationship of a passing band exploiting available resources and moving on. Marcus's Wall is one of several similar features now documented across the highland margins of the Tasmanian southwest, all of them modest. All of them below the visibility threshold of satellite survey in their individual scale, but collectively adding up to a pattern of stone construction across an area of several thousand square kilometers, a pattern that says these valleys were used. They were used repeatedly by people who returned to them and who built things to serve the activities they conducted there. They were not wilderness in any meaningful sense of that word during the period in question. They were managed landscape, inhabited landscape, country. That is the word that Aboriginal Australians use for the land they are connected to. Not land in the abstract sense of territory or real estate. Country in the specific sense of a place that has a relationship with the people who belong to it. A place that knows them, that has been shaped by their management and their care, that carries their history and its features. Country that people are responsible to, not just responsible for. The highland margins of the Tasmanian southwest are country in exactly this sense. They carry the history of the people who manage them. That history is written in the walls that Marcus found, and in the enclosures mapped by satellite survey, and in the standing stones, and the drainage channels, and the anomalous hydrology, and the charcoal layers in the sediment cores. The country knows what happened here, even when the people who made it happen are no longer present to tell the story. And the country is being read, slowly and with difficulty, because the language it speaks, the language of geomorphology and hydrology and sediment chemistry and astronomical geometry, is not a language that is easy to master or that yields its meanings quickly, but it is being read. Each new reading adds a little more to the picture. A piece of the drainage system here, a new dating result there, a new identification of a structural feature that had previously been catalogued as natural geology. The picture is incomplete. It will remain incomplete for a long time, but its outline is becoming discernible, and the outline says complex, extensive, old, sophisticated. The outline says civilization, and then there are the questions that the physical evidence alone cannot answer. The questions about consciousness and intention and meaning, about what the people who built these things believed, about how they understood their relationship to the landscape and to the sky and to each other. These questions live in the space between the stones and the stars, in the interval between the rising of the sun and the marking of it in granite, in the relationship between the act of management and the meaning of management, between the practical and the sacred, which for these people were not separate categories. We cannot answer them from the evidence, not fully, not yet, perhaps not ever. But we can recognize that they are the right questions, that the full story of what happened here is not just a story about construction and agriculture and population density. It is a story about meaning, about how a people understood the world they inhabited and their place in it. That understanding was sophisticated. It was old. It was deeply embedded in a relationship with this specific landscape that had been developing over tens of thousands of years. It expressed itself in the structures that are left behind, and in the ceremonies and stories and relationships to place that survived in fragments through the colonial catastrophe, and in the cultural knowledge that the Aboriginal Tasmanian community carries today. It is a kind of understanding that the dominant culture of the modern world has largely lost and is slowly, painfully beginning to recognize that it has lost. The understanding of place, of belonging to a specific landscape in a deep and responsible way, of knowing a country well enough to manage it sustainably across generations, of reading the sky and the land and the water as a single integrated system whose dynamics are legible to those who have learned the language. Tasmania's megastructures are evidence that this kind of understanding once existed here, in full development, in practical expression, in built form that endures when everything else is gone. That evidence is not just of historical interest, it is of urgent, contemporary relevance. Because the challenges that face the world in the coming century, the challenges of climate change and ecological degradation, and the unsustainability of current patterns of land use and resource extraction, are precisely the challenges that a deep, patient, integrative understanding of place addresses, not completely, not by itself, but in ways that the dominant models of land management have consistently failed to capture. The ancient drainage system on the central plateau managed water in a landscape where too much water in the wrong places was the primary constraint on productivity. It did so sustainably, for long enough that the infrastructure required constant maintenance rather than replacement. It was the product of generations of observation and experimentation and refinement. The kind of knowledge that accumulates slowly and resists simplification. The modern world needs that kind of knowledge. It needs it urgently. And one of the places that knowledge might still be recoverable, in fragments that can be assembled with patience and collaboration and genuine respect for the community that carries them, is Tasmania. This is the practical stakes of the megastructure story. Not just understanding the past, using the knowledge that the past contains, that the landscape preserves, that the surviving culture holds, to address the challenges of the present. That is a high bar to set. It requires more than archaeology. It requires the kind of deep, sustained, collaborative engagement between researchers and community members and land managers and ecologists that does not happen quickly or cheaply or without significant institutional commitment. It requires humility and patience and willingness to be wrong and to revise. But the potential return, in knowledge that can inform how we manage these landscapes and others like them through the unprecedented environmental challenges of the coming century, is extraordinary. The pre-collapse Tasmanian civilization figured out how to sustain a dense, complex population in one of the most challenging environments in the southern hemisphere for thousands of years. They did it without industrial inputs, without fossil fuels, without the accumulated technological capital of the modern world. They did it with knowledge, deep, specific, tested, practical knowledge of how this landscape works. That knowledge is not entirely gone. It is fragmented and scattered and partially encoded in a landscape that has been recovering from the end of its management for 12,000 years. But it is recoverable. And recovering it, to whatever degree is possible, is one of the most valuable things that the current generation of researchers working on this material could achieve. This is the call to attention that the megastructures are making, not to wonder, not to sensation, to serious, sustained, collaborative inquiry in the service of recovering knowledge that the world needs. The stones are standing. The plateau is there. The community is there. The tools are there. What remains is the will. And if anything in this long exploration of the evidence has added to the will of even a few people to support and engage with this work, then the time spent in this exploration has been well used. The morning will come, the sun will rise, the stones will mark it, and the work goes on. Let us return, one last time, to the beginning of this story. To the island hanging at the bottom of the world like a forgotten punctuation mark, to the forests that cover the evidence and the bogs that preserve it, and the sea that hides most of it from any view we currently have the technology to achieve. Let us return to that island and let it be what the evidence says it is, not the end of the earth, the center of a story about human beings doing what human beings do everywhere they settle in enough numbers for long enough periods of time. A story about people figuring out how to live in a particular place, learning its rhythms, learning its resources, learning its limits, and then, slowly, carefully, with the accumulated knowledge of generations, extending those limits, managing the landscape to produce more, building infrastructure to make the management sustainable, watching the sky to understand the timing of everything, building markers in the landscape to encode what they learned so that the knowledge would outlast any individual. This is the human story, repeated in different forms in every corner of the planet where human beings have lived long enough to accumulate the knowledge that the place demands. Tasmania is not an exception to that story. It is one of its most extraordinary chapters. Extraordinary for its age. Extraordinary for its scale relative to the size of the island and the difficulty of its environment. Extraordinary for the catastrophe that ended it and the survival that followed the catastrophe and the fragmented inheritance that came down through 10,000 years to the people who are still here. And extraordinary for the fact that the evidence of it is still readable, still present, still capable of speaking to those who know how to listen. The stones are still there. The channels are still there. The ghost patterns in the hydrology are still there. The sediment cores still hold their chemical records of fire and management, and then the long silence of recovery. The sea floor still covers what the sea covered. The caves still hold their walls. All of it, still there, waiting. We are listening. We are beginning to understand. And the story we are hearing is one of the most remarkable stories in the long, extraordinary, still largely untold history of human beings making their world and then losing it, and then, slowly, beginning to find it again. Tasmania, the island at the bottom of the world, the center of a story that is still being told. Listen to it, learn it, help recover it. It deserves to be known. And to everyone who has listened this far, who has stayed with this story through its length and its complexity, and its refusal to resolve into easy answers, you are part of the recovery. Your attention is part of what makes it possible to keep asking these questions in a world that often prefers comfortable answers. Keep asking, keep listening, keep paying attention to what the evidence actually says rather than what we wish it said. The truth is out there, in the stones, in the sediment, in the culture, and the collaboration. And it is more extraordinary than any simplified version of it could be. Good night, rest well, and thank you for being the kind of person who cares about this. It matters more than you know. There is one last image to carry into sleep. Picture the central plateau of Tasmania at the moment, just before dawn. The air is cold, cold enough that every breath is visible. The stars are still bright, because the sky here, far from any city, is the kind of sky that makes you understand why human beings have always watched it. The Milky Way is fading as the first light begins to diffuse through the atmosphere to the east. The Southern Cross, that great navigational anchor of the southern sky, is moving toward the horizon, and the planets, if any are visible in the east, are beginning to lose their edge in the growing light. The stones are there. They have been there all night. They have been there for 12,000 nights, and many thousands more, since the hands that placed them withdrew and the people who used them moved on or diminished or changed into something different. The stones do not know any of this. Stones do not know things, but they hold the record of the knowing that placed them. The careful observation, the precise measurement, the decision about exactly where to set each stone so that the light would fall in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And now, in the cold, pre-dawn air of the central plateau, the light is arriving. The horizon is brightening in the east, not uniformly. At a specific point on the horizon, a point that the stones were placed to mark, the light grows. The point of brightness intensifies. And then, just as it has done on this day at this time every year for the entire history of the earth, the sun rises. It rises exactly where the stones mark it to rise. The light falls through the gap between the two positioned marker stones and lands on the prepared ground beyond. For a moment, the ancient geometry is fulfilled. The intention of the placing and the effect of the placing are united across 12,000 years. Nobody sees it. Nobody who knows the full weight of what is happening is watching. But the alignment holds. The stones do their work. And the sun rises, indifferent to all of it, exactly where it was always going to rise. That is the image. That is the thing to carry into sleep. The sun rising where the stones mark it. The alignment holding across 12,000 years of silence. The intention of the builders reaching forward through all of that time, through the catastrophe and the collapse and the survival and the loss and the recovery, reaching forward to this morning, this specific morning, and being fulfilled. That endurance is the deepest thing about this story. Not the scale of the structures or the sophistication of the management or the extent of the civilization. The endurance. The fact that human intention, embedded in stone, can persist across timescales that dwarf the entire recorded history of writing in cities and empires. The fact that the past is not entirely past, that the things human beings did with care and skill and knowledge echo forward in ways that outlast everything else about the moment of their doing. The echo of the Tasmanian civilization is still sounding. In the stones, in the channels, in the culture, in the people, in the ongoing inquiry that is slowly recovering what can be recovered of what was here. Listen for it. It is worth hearing. And now, truly, good night. The sun is rising over the plateau. The stones are fulfilled for another year. And the long story of what happened here, And what it means continues to be told by everyone who pays attention to it. You are part of that telling now. One more thing. Something small but worth saying. The Aboriginal Tasmanians, who were described by European observers in the 18th century, were described in terms of what they lacked. They did not have metal, they did not have pottery, they did not have agriculture, or at least none that was visible to European eyes trained to recognize agriculture in its European form. They did not have large permanent settlements. They did not have writing. They did not have the things that European observers used as markers of civilization, and so they were described as not having civilization, as being primitive, as representing an early stage of human development from which other peoples had already progressed. This description was not just wrong in the factual sense of being inconsistent with the evidence, it was wrong in the structural sense of using the wrong categories. The civilization that the Aboriginal Tasmanians' ancestors had built and that had collapsed before the European encounter was not less developed than European civilization. It was differently developed. It was adapted to its specific environment in ways that European civilization was not, and has not been, in the centuries since, been able to match. It was sustainable in ways that European land use in Australia has never been. Getting that wrong had consequences that lasted for generations. Getting it right has consequences for generations to come. The megastructures are the evidence. The evidence is there. The question is whether we are willing to let it change what we think we know. That willingness is the beginning of justice as much as it is the beginning of knowledge. Good night. The work goes on.